Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is August 23rd, 2026, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it. Another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Sire,
Hi, how are you?
doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Can't complain. Just enjoying my raccoon diet and also going on a walk today. That probably didn't help.
You eat garbage, or...
Just junk food. Went to
Oh,
Jack in the Box today.
I see. What do you like at Jack in the Box?
Yeah, mostly the curly fries.
I see. We've had pretty lively weekend with TI. I guess it was most of this week as well. So it's the big Dota tournament each year that has the usually biggest prize pool, but I think due to the Saudis, it's not the biggest prize pool anymore. But yeah, it was very epic. The grand finals went to game 5 in the best of series, so that was very good. It meant they were pretty evenly matched. It was cool seeing the production. It was hosted in Shanghai this year, and it was very well produced. The venue looked really fancy and clean and futuristic. They even made like a kung fu movie-ish thing, like a short sketch video with one of the Chinese former pro players named Burning. He's famous for being an anti-mage farmer, where he picks anti-mage, but he farms kind of by himself for a long time, but he does so really fast. So he was a defining carry in the early days. They made a sketch video with him, which was cool. So hyping up the Chinese scene and the scene in general, because he's, I think, a global name, but a Chinese player. So it was cool to
Mhm.
feature him there.
Gotcha.
It's amusing seeing interviews where the host country is not English, which means that if you ever say anything, it has to be translated before the mic is passed to anybody else. So
Hmm.
conversations are delayed in the sense that a person asks you a question and then the question is translated and then your response is translated. So cool to see that. Good job, China, hosting TI this year. I think it mostly went without a hitch from what I saw. People said that the series overall and just the event between the group stage and the finals was very entertaining. Good meta, good hero variety. It was cool seeing my main hero, Terrorblade, drafted a few times to good success. He's not a hero that's picked often, and usually you want to make sure there's a specific draft where he counters stuff and is going to shine. But the best carry player in the world, Yotoro, played him a few times with a good win rate. So that was fun to see. And the amazing feature of Dota that I think StarCraft would have liked to put in the game is whenever you're watching these finals, you can load the match as it's happening live in your Dota client, and you can take the players' perspectives and see what they're doing, what they're clicking on, and what their camera's focusing on the whole game. So for me to just learn a character that I play, I just take the POV of the best player in the world at that character, which is awesome. So it feels like a really excellent both entertainment tool of getting to just see more about the game, but then also to learn the game more by being able to see it from different vantage points. You can look at different stats in the game client. So that was a fun way to watch TI this year. I had not done so in that same manner in the past. This is the first international tournament where I've tracked the tournament through the game client. But it's cool.
Did you learn a lot?
Yeah, I took some notes. He tends to always be in the right part of the map, and he tends to get ahead early. I'm still stuck on the getting ahead early part. So there's a good deal of practice to be had. The character that I was studying has a lot of item variety, which is cool in that you can kit him out in different ways and he's really strong. But if you make the wrong choices with your itemization, he ends up being a good bit weaker in the situation. So it's sort of like watching his play through this tournament reveals certain things which raise new questions. Because I can't just copy what he did and expect that to work, because he did certain things in certain situations. So you have to kind of see it and then interpret why the decision was made so you can adapt it to your own practice.
It sounds like that's a really great tool to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a fan. A big fan. But I don't know what else has been happening in the week. I've been watching less stuff because TI's been on, so it's been mostly that for me. I want to watch more of those geography videos where it breaks down a geographical feature and explains how it shaped the Earth around it and the economy and so on.
Yeah, they can be fun. Have you ever heard of Geography Now?
No? What's that?
It's a YouTube channel that does content on just countries and human geography, political geography, physical geography, etc. It might be something to check out if you're interested in watching more geography stuff on YouTube.
Definitely. That's one of the healthy things to introduce to your algorithm, because different platforms, they're always trying to serve you new stuff that they think you'll get hooked on, and a lot of stuff just works on people in general. A funny thing that's crept into mine is sometimes wrestlers like WWE will show up. Like John Cena, he's nice and he says things, and there are lots of clippable moments of what he does. That'll just show up in my feed, even though I haven't followed the sport historically. So having geography, I think, is a nice, healthy way to just learn a little thing here or there. It makes days feel better when you learn something. You have something positive to talk to other people about. Even if you're not in school, it can be nice to learn.
Yeah. Well, anything else been going on in the past week?
The motorcycle rally is over, so things have simmered down somewhat.
How did that go?
Well, as with every year, a lot of people die because it's a time of great risk and indulgence at the same time. You're putting people on motorcycles. A lot of them are not high skill on motorcycles, but it's high traffic and high danger for this event because there are so many vehicles. So there are lots of opportunities for failure. Plus, alcohol and drugs are around, which you can kind of do the math there. So how that's going to impact people's ability to operate their vehicles. No main disaster or big disasters that I heard about, just kind of the usual. Some people party too hard and make a mistake. But a lot of different bands perform. People show off their motorcycles and party. It's a time when the population of South Dakota balloons from being one of the lowest population states in America to kind of in the middle for a brief period of time.
Did it impact your town at all, wherever you are?
Oh, yeah. There are just motorcycles parked all up and down the streets. If you go to any of the typical like chain restaurants, they're going to be super packed compared to usual. So like the Subway and the Dairy Queen and things like that. But they don't really go, these motorcycle riders, they don't really go as much for the gourmet restaurants. So one of them even closes during the motorcycle week because they don't get very much relative business. And the customers are more ornery than the clients they want. So they just kind of close up shop and wait for it to blow over. But other places take it as an opportunity to get a lot more money. They typically want expedience with their orders too, because a lot of them are kind of passing through and going on different motorcycle trails in the state. They're not really looking to settle into a town for a week or something. It's more so they want to pass through, buy something in town, could be food, could be a souvenir, and then drive away. So not a huge impact, but yeah, there's definitely more than usual activity. It's very funny to see tourists complain about there only being one restroom of each gender in the restaurants. And it's like, well, we don't normally have that many customers, so we
Yeah.
wouldn't be using multiple restrooms if we had them. But whenever it's tourist season, it looks like it's underserving.
Gotcha. Wow. Well, hopefully they didn't inconvenience you too much.
Nope. I'm pretty out of the way, so the major noise and traffic doesn't really bother me too much. I operate on the internet most of the time, which
An
is
ideal state of affairs.
yes. Low travel required. They changed the economy size in StarCraft as well. That's one other kind of community buzz thing that people are talking about, especially this past week. They took us from a 12 worker start to an 8 worker start. They changed some other stuff as well, but that's probably the single largest change in terms of how the game plays out and feels. And a lot of people, they were kind of for it, but then it's settled into most of the pros don't like it. So a lot of the player base numbers are down somewhat. We'll see if it bounces back or if they make any changes. A lot of the process they use to make changes is opaque to the regular player. There is a balance council, which includes some pro gamers and commentators, but we don't know exactly who's on it, I think. And they're obviously under NDA, so they can't discuss their meetings with us. But Blizzard is apparently fairly difficult to communicate with in the current state, for just kind of asking, like, when are we getting patches? What are the reasons for things? Not all of that is very well described. But it is still getting updates, so that's more help than some games get.
True.
And we'll see with BlizzCon what happens. They're probably going to announce something. A lot of people are suspecting potentially a StarCraft shooting game, FPS.
That could be cool.
Yeah.
Emphasis on could. I'm a little wary. I think they canceled their last one, right?
Yeah. There was Titan, and that was canceled, and then I think it gave birth to Overwatch. So some overlap between the two of those projects.
Well, there was another one too, like way back in the day. There was one that was based off of was it Nova, the sniper?
Yeah, that was
The
StarCraft Ghost. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, they spent a bunch of money on that and then ended up canceling it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little wary.
Well, with that Microsoft money, we'll see.
So why didn't the pros like the lower SCV? Well, I guess it's what is it, workers?
Yeah, worker count. It doesn't really add a phase of the game that's very fun to play, especially if you're a full-time player. It's the period in the game where you have 8 workers, and then the period where you have 9 workers, and then the period where you have 10 workers, 11 workers, and then you're back to where you started. That sequence in how a match plays out does have certain builds. There are aggressive builds that can happen in that time. But once you get used to them and you know what they are, then it just feels like, okay, I have a couple more early chores to do. But the rest of the game ends up converging to the same point. So why did we have to do those early chores at the start again? When it's the slowest paced part of the game, we've practiced this the greatest number of times, and at that spot of the game, you can't touch your opponent yet because they're across the map from you. So it's the least interactive time frame.
Gotcha. Huh. Fair enough.
Yep. It was a reasonable thing to try because the first iteration of StarCraft 2, Wings of Liberty, had a 6-worker start, and Legacy of the Void has a 12-worker start. So it's kind of splitting the difference and seeing if maybe something between those was optimal. Alas. I argued in favor of the 12 worker start in a talk show called The Pylon Show. I was brought on with a few other guests. There was a guy who had made lots of posts and write-ups about how he believed the 6 worker start was better. So we just went on and kind of argued that. And one of my main points of argumentation for why the 12 worker start was better was because the 6 worker start to the 12 worker start, it's a very boring time period for the commentators because they have to basically fill time and talk about their pizza for 2 minutes while players are just doing setup. They're establishing stuff. The 12 worker start is kind of like how certain car races have a rolling start as opposed to you're starting from 0. So I feel like entertainment value, it's better to have a 12 worker start. Yes, there are some cool cheeses that exist with a low worker count, but they're rarely used. And even with the higher worker count, there is still the earliest attack you could execute, and that will still happen sometimes. Yep, We'll see what they end up doing with it. I'll keep playing the game pretty much regardless of what they do. It's too fun, too satisfying, and too unique to not want to play it. I've tried the other RTSs that are around, like Age of Empires and stuff, and a lot of them just don't feel as punchy and interactive as StarCraft 2 does. It's been very optimized. It feels very crisp. Handling all the units, the way they move around is something that feels like you can anticipate it nicely. Many other games, they end up feeling clunky or slow for some reason. Sometimes it's hard to be able to tell why, but good job of making a C2.
Well, was there anything you wanted to get to first?
What region was I thinking about? Oh, I felt like... I'm just pulling up a map here. Did I tell you that I saw a geography video on the Red Sea?
I don't think so.
You
mentioned the one about the Kalahari Desert.
Right.
And I think there was another one last week.
Yeah, last week I think I mentioned the coast of Alaska.
Okay.
Yeah, that was when Russia had it. The Russian Empire, from the explorer Bering, he went over into the Americas. They ended up claiming Alaska and then making the natives farm sea otter pelts for them because those were super valuable in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to my parents about that, and my mom was saying not only are the sea otter pelts really dense and they help keep you warm, they're waterproof. So that's like a waterproof winter wear item that nature produces. You do have to kill a sea otter, obviously, to get one of those. But yeah, for the time, that was a thing that they did. But they overfarmed them, which then degraded the value of Alaska for Russia. And they were fighting Turkey, apparently, and sold Alaska to us to help pay for the war. Why were they fighting them?
Well, let's see. That would have been 1860s. You sure it was Turkey?
That's what the video said. They may have meant the Ottoman Empire.
Well, same thing, pretty much. Maybe I need to brush up on my Russo-Turkish wars, but I don't remember any in the 1860s. I'm probably just forgetting. Because the big ones were more in the early 1800s and then again in the late 1800s. But the mid 1800s, I'm not as familiar with. Because the Russo-Turkish War in the early 1800s resulted in Greek independence. That kind of wrapped up into the Western intervention there. And then in the late 1800s, it resulted in a gaggle of countries in the Balkans getting independence. But 1853 to 56, Crimean War. No, it's not the same thing. Yeah, I know there's one in the 1870s, but that's too early for Alaska, or too late for Alaska.
They may have meant
Yeah,
the
I'm not.
Crimea thing. I'm not sure.
Sorry, what?
They may have meant the Crimea conflict. That was between Russia and Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire.
Mostly it was between the Russians and the British and the French,
Oh,
but I think the Ottomans technically were involved as well. They were pretty. The Ottoman Empire was pretty weak at that point, so they really were not powerful enough to challenge Russia on their own.
mm-hmm.
Which is why they were getting assistance from the British and French at the time. Yeah, I had thought that the Russians were trying to raise money as part of their campaign to end serfdom. But it sounds like they were trying to pay. Maybe it was the debt from the war. Actually, that could make sense. Because I don't see any wars here that overlap with the sale of Alaska. The sale of Alaska was after the American Civil War. And the only Russo-Turkish War before that would have been in the 1850s, the Crimean War. So if they were trying to pay off the debt from that, I could see that as being viable.
I see. Well, the one that I saw on the Red Sea talked about how it's the warmest body of water on Earth because it's kind of encircled by desert, and it has a lot of coral reefs in it, which were pretty hazardous to navigate. But famously, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, it was a female pharaoh, she took an expedition down the Red Sea to go to the Kushite kingdom or whatever I think it's called. But that was one of the first periods where they had a record of navigating it like all the way. And pretty sure it's one of the saltiest bodies of water in the world as well. So the people in that region, I think, use desalination plants primarily for their water source, since that's obviously not going to be drinkable for them.
Yeah, the Red Sea kind of has a history of domination by the Ottomans, I think it was. Because the Ottoman Empire controlled the coast of what is now Saudi Arabia for much of the past couple hundred years. Also Egypt for a long time, although that was kind of a funky special case. Yeah, I can't remember the name for Ottoman vassals, but basically Egypt was one of those. So they had a lot of autonomy. It wasn't necessarily like a full-on province that was directly controlled from Constantinople or Istanbul. Yeah, I think the Portuguese tried to get in there for a while, but I don't think they were very successful. The Portuguese were pretty good at getting little toeholds here and there, different parts of the world that were important trading routes. But I don't think they ever got into the Red Sea in any substantive way. I think Socotra was the closest they came. That's the island off the coast of Yemen with the really funky trees.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the Ottomans held on to it until World War One. Well, actually, after World War One, technically, as part of the peace treaty ending it, they had to give up pretty much all of that. And after that, basically, European powers kind of predominated there.
It said one entrance of the Red Sea is man-made and one is naturally occurring.
Yeah. Yeah, what is it? The Bab el-Mandeb Strait? Something like that. It's not as famous as the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, Bab el-Mandeb. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I think Aden is pretty close to that now. Aden is the biggest city in Yemen. It's a coastal city on the Red Sea. Yeah, even before the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the British actually controlled that. It was one of their big outposts there in that region. Nope, I was wrong. I was right about Aden, but it's not in the Red Sea. It's actually east of the strait in question.
I've been to Sharm el Sheikh.
Sharm el Sheikh, where is that?
It's in Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula. Gives you access to the Red Sea.
Oh. What was it like?
Well, desert, but the water was really cool. Well, I mean, it was warm, but it was interesting to see all the sea life and stuff. I think the coral reef there is in quite good shape. The Great Barrier Reef from Australia is looking worse for wear at this point. I think it's mostly bleached and dead.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably the best place you can go for snorkeling and scuba diving, like to see a reef. The people were nice. We were on the resort most of the time in Sharm el Sheikh. One interesting thing that was different in terms of just cultural and social norms was the drivers don't drive with their headlights on at nighttime. They consider it rude because there are street lights above the street shining down on it, so they consider it already well enough lit to drive, and you only turn your lights on if you're trying to like flash someone or piss them off. They'll get upset at you if you have your lights on. So found that very eerie that they all agreed to not use their lights at night, at least in this area. In Cairo they do still, I think, in lots of cases, because you're in the city. Obviously you don't want to crash into somebody. But yeah, Sharm el Sheikh was a bit different. I remember it was very overwhelming when we exited the resort and we were going to go get a taxi back to Cairo. There were so many taxi drivers, probably like 20 or 25 taxi drivers, and they all kind of swarmed us at once offering a taxi. We've never been offered a taxi by that many people at one time. It was amazing. They really had a surplus of driver to passenger ratio at that location.
Wow. How long ago would this have been?
This would have been 2008.
2008. Got it. So that's actually before the Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's when they had the more U.S. friendly leader. What was his name?
Mubarak?
Mubarak?
Yeah, Mubarak. I think that's right. Yeah, Hosni Mubarak. It's actually a Greek name, I think, or it has Greek origins. Yeah, Greeks were like the landed elite in Egypt for a long time after Alexander conquered it. So there's more than a few people in Egypt even today that have surnames that are of Greek origin.
Mm-hmm. But he was thrown out.
Yeah, got kicked out, replaced by that Muslim Brotherhood guy. I don't even remember his name anymore. Yeah, he was thrown out in another military coup. So now they got the new guy in. What was his name? Sisi.
One of the things that stood out when I was in Egypt was the welcome norm of corruption, low-level corruption.
Yeah.
There are guards who protect the pyramids, and they don't allow you to climb on the pyramids. It's against the rules. But there is one exception to the rule, which is $20. If the guard happens to receive $20 from someone or one of your representatives, then he may face the other way as you end up climbing the pyramids. So
Yeah.
that kind of thing, in a lot of countries, a rule is a rule, and they're not going to accept bribes just because they don't do that. But other places, they do that, and they welcome that as a source of their revenue. It's pretty funny.
I remember reading that a lot of the guys involved in the pyramid tourist trade in Egypt ended up getting paid by the government to attack protesters during the Arab Spring protests.
Whoa.
I mean, obviously they had an interest in ending the protests since they were disrupting, tourism.
Mm-hmm.
So they were seeing disruptions to their income. So the government found more than a few takers. I remember there was a camel charge at one point. A bunch of guys that rode camels and provided rides for tourists got paid off, and so they basically had like a full cavalry charge against protesters.
Wow.
It's pretty wild watching the video. Yeah, camels have been used as cavalry for a very long time. They're not just pack animals.
Yep. They're pretty mean. They spit on us. The
Yeah, I
food was
think that
very
whole-
good, and they have very good coffee there, as a note.
Oh, really?
Yep. It's very dense. Like a very intense coffee. Strong flavor, very bold, and they don't water it down like the Americano is pretty watered down. You're not a caffeine drinker, are you?
No, I stopped drinking caffeine a long time ago.
When did you stop?
Probably in high school.
Huh.
Yeah, I used to drink a whole shit ton of soft drinks and stuff back then.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't doing me any favors, so I quit. And I never drank coffee or anything. And so, kind of before I knew it, I'd lost any tolerance to caffeine. So, whenever I did have it, I would get kind of sick.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I just swore it off entirely. It just wasn't worth the effort. Well, I was going to say that whole Red Sea region is pretty sparsely populated. Like the Egyptian government had to go out of its way to develop sort of the touristy resort areas on its coast that exist today,
Mm-hmm.
because they weren't really there before. And I think a lot of those resort cities are the main population centers there. I think there is maybe one big port city, but I don't remember its name. It's not the one on the Suez Canal. There's actually another one on further southwest of that. And I don't think the Saudis have a whole lot of population. Obviously, coastal Saudi Arabia is like their main population center.
Mm-hmm.
It's where the population density is highest in Saudi Arabia. But there's still not a whole lot of people overall. Because I think Saudi Arabia's population is like 40 million people, something like that. So maybe the coastal population is something like 10 to 20 million. And Ethiopia is probably denser. I think, well, no, they don't have any coast there anymore. So Eritrea technically is what it would be now.
Anymore? They had the coast for a while.
Yeah, when Eritrea was still part of Ethiopia, all of that coastline Eritrea has was Ethiopian coastline.
Oh. When did Eritrea come about?
Early 90s, I want to say. Would have been after or during the tail end of the big civil war in Ethiopia that lasted so long.
Mm-hmm.
1991, according to Wikipedia.
I see.
Yeah, so Ethiopia lost its entire coastline because of that.
Yeah. Coastline is valuable. That's a big blow.
Yeah, yeah, they've been trying in recent years to develop infrastructure so that they're more connected to other ports, since obviously their infrastructure before was mostly hooked up to ports on the Eritrean coast. I think they had an agreement with Djibouti for a long time, and I think more recently they've been working with Somaliland to try to build up some infrastructure. Because they don't have good relations with Eritrea. So supplies that move through their territory are not entirely reliable. You never know when the Eritreans might cut them off.
Mm-hmm.
Saudi population is about 35.2 million. So I was a little high. But yeah, Red Sea's pretty quiet, other than the Yemenis anyway. Obviously, there's lots of drama in Yemen, but the rest of it is pretty well behaved. Oh yeah, there is like a very narrow slice of coastline that actually belongs to Israel on the Red Sea. You can't really see it very well on a map, but it is there. Yeah, what is that, like 10 kilometers or something? Probably not even that. Yeah, the Israelis lobbied pretty hard for that just before independence. They were very keen to try to have a port there. Basically had to build it out of nothing. For a long time after independence, they couldn't really use it because the Egyptians wouldn't allow them, wouldn't allow any shipping to go through that channel there. I'm not sure what that's called, actually. Yeah, there's like a big bay right there. That's pretty close to where the Saudis are trying to develop that experimental city, the Neom project.
The line thing?
Yeah, yeah, that's the one. That's kind of located up in there.
I heard it was a pretty major driving safety hazard to not have any curvature in the road. Tends to promote more alertness from driver if there's some variation in the terrain, which is why I think even for long stretches of road in places like Texas or Kansas, they'll intentionally just add some curve.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea with Neom is to have almost all of the transportation be public transport.
Mm-hmm.
So everything is supposed to be connected by way of high speed rail or trams or what have you. I think they are planning to have roads, but I don't think they're really meant for like mass cars. Mass cars isn't the word I want. I don't think that it's meant to have like a whole lot of traffic
Vehicle
from
traffic,
people
yeah.
driving their own cars. Yeah. I'm not sure what the status of that project is. I think they had to make some pretty big cuts.
It's interesting seeing how certain wealthy oil nations will try to invest their money in other stuff to diversify and just be ready for the future and be competitive in the future. They definitely have been throwing money at esports fairly recently. It wasn't like a thing that I remember in early days of esports. There was more in the US, it was bigger for a lot of the main titles, but now the highest paying tournament of the year is often EWC for gamers, and that's a Saudi Arabia event. Or maybe it's Dubai. I think it's Saudi money.
Yeah, Saudi. Pretty sure. Yeah, that's kind of a recent thing, and that's not really a part of their diversification effort. That's more PR.
Mm.
Ever since the Khashoggi assassination, the Saudis have kind of have had problems with public relations.
Mm.
So they launched a big effort to try to improve it by buying into a bunch of sports competitions, gaming competitions, what have you. They
Mm.
have that big comedy tour that got Bill Burr in so much trouble, stuff
Mm.
like that. But that's not really meant to be like, that's not part of the strategy to diversify the economy away from oil. They're doing other stuff as part of that.
Mm.
In Saudi Arabia's case, the Neom project is one example. They're also trying to get more Saudis involved in their labor market because a lot of them kind of are not or haven't been historically.
Mm.
Investing in education, allowing women to travel and work more, all of that stuff is more in the diversification, part of the diversification project.
And another country that is kind of rich off of oil is Norway. They're small population, but they found a shitload of oil, I think, in the North Sea somewhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, they invested that just in a wealth fund that's been quite strong for them. I think their cost of living is quite high as a result of that, but they also have a lot of amenities they give their citizens. I think it's a pretty socialist structured country.
Kind of. I mean, the government does spend a lot of money on the public, uh, but I think they are still mostly a free market economy. It's just one with very strong social benefits.
Mm.
Lots of oil royalties combined with a relatively small population means that per capita they can kind of afford to splurge on their population.
Mm-hmm.
But they're pretty smart about it. I think most of that money actually ends up in a sovereign wealth fund. Norway has one of the largest sovereign wealth funds on the planet. If they want to invest in something, they can dump a lot of money into it.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a lot of debate in Norway over the past 10 years about the sovereign wealth fund because there was a lot of people who were interested in trying to green the sovereign wealth fund. In other words, they wanted it to invest strategically to encourage renewable energy and try to
Mm.
diversify away from fossil fuel industries, which was a little bit ironic because the money from the fund, again, largely came from, fossil fuel industry.
Mm.
So, there was kind of a sense that the opposition basically was arguing that, we make our money from the fossil fuel industry. It doesn't really make sense to kind of undermine it by trying to starve it of investment money. And then, of course, the camp in favor argued that, it was necessary. The energy wasn't going to last forever anyway. Oil is going to run out eventually. So we should start preparing by not only diversifying the sovereign wealth fund, but also just trying to diversify our own economy and build up alternative industries. It's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do, etc.
Mm.
So there was a whole ass public debate about that in Norwegian politics for a while. I don't think they ever did divest from fossil fuel industries.
Don't
But
piss
I
off
could
the
be
oil
wrong.
gods. Clearly, they favor us.
Pretty much. Yeah, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it eventually. And we do appreciate the feedback that we get on here. It's always fun hearing from people. So participation is encouraged in that regard.
Thanks, Chan. Is there any other region that I was learning about?
Well, you mentioned oil-producing countries diversifying. Probably the standout success story is the Emiratis, because their economy had not really produced a whole lot of oil. I think they are a major producer, but they never produced nearly as much as like the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or what have you. But they were able to take that oil money and invest it smartly into other sectors of their economy. And as a result now, they have a very strong financial sector and they have a burgeoning manufacturing sector.
Huh.
So they've been very, very smart about that, and they have a lot to show for it.
What do they manufacture?
Sorry, what?
What do they manufacture?
They've been trying to get into military stuff. So like armored cars, armored vehicles, drones, stuff like that. Stuff that is either low barrier to entry, like armored cars, or stuff that is relatively new but cheap, like drones. All of that stuff tends to attract new entrants into the market. I don't think they're trying to develop like big ticket weapon systems like new fighters, tanks, stuff like that. That's still a little too advanced for them. They're focusing on sort of the low profit margin stuff, where a new entrant into the market can be more competitive. I think they're doing some electronic stuff too, some electronic warfare packages, telecommunications, stuff like that. But I'm not sure what the status of that stuff is. But yeah, they've done a lot of good work. Kudos to them. They're head and tails ahead of the Saudis and the Qataris, or the Kuwaitis for that matter. I don't even know if the Kuwaitis have a diversification plan. If they do, I haven't heard of it. Are you familiar with Kuwait?
Not very. Wasn't there a war involving them a while back?
Oh yeah, the first Gulf War. Yeah, that's basically how everybody my age knows them. Kuwait is interesting because it's allied to the United States. Not by a treaty, mind you, but unofficially, it's aligned with the United States. And of all the countries in the region, you could make the strongest case with Kuwait that they actually have more of a formal alliance, or something akin to one, because the Kuwaitis are heavily dependent on the United States for their defense. And unlike with other countries that the US has relations with in the region, the United States has actually fought a war to liberate the Kuwaitis. So the credibility of American promises to defend Kuwait have relatively more credibility with them than they do with some other countries in the region.
They have actually received help, not just thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, exactly. But Kuwait is also interesting because of the countries that the United States is aligned with in the region, the Kuwaitis are the only ones that have a clear-cut majority Shia population. I'm not counting Iraq. Iraq is not really aligned with the United States. They're kind of in a very awkward position where two rival powers are basically fighting over them, but it can't really fully align with either. Kuwait, by contrast, is very clearly on the side of the Americans. And unlike the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, well, maybe the Bahrainis actually. I think Bahrain does technically have a majority Shia population, but it's like 60-40, and it's narrowing over time. And the government is actually heavily Sunni and doesn't really get along with the Shia population. Yeah, Kuwait, by contrast, is like 90% Shia Muslim, and the leadership itself is Shia. So it's kind of an outlier in the region in that regard.
I see. What's the ethnic makeup?
Oh, it's all Arab. It's like 99% Arab, whatever it is. Demographics of Kuwait. Oh, yeah, they have a large population of non Arabs because of migrant workers. What is it, like 2.6 million looks like Arabs, and then 1.6 million Asians.
Would that
Probably pretty
Asian
heavily.
stat include Indians?
Yeah,
I see.
actually, I can see they break it down here, looks like. So the actual indigenous Kuwaitis make up about 30% of the population. 1.3 million looks like. And then Indians are about 24%, 1.1 million. There's still a pretty significant Arab population just because they get migrants also from other Arab countries. But they're divided amongst a whole bunch of different Arab countries. There's not one big one. Looks like Egypt is the largest source, about 600 some thousand. And then over 250,000 from Bangladesh and Pakistan. A lot of Filipinos, huh? About 250,000 from them too. As far as migrant workers, pretty much regardless of country, the Philippines, India are going to be some of the major sources. Bangladesh and Pakistan to a lesser degree.
Well, India is going to be a high contributor just because they're huge population in general. The Philippines isn't as high. So I guess that raises the question, why do more people pursue that from the Philippines relative to other countries?
It's still a relatively poor country. I think the region around Manila is doing pretty well, and there's a couple other urban standouts, but there's a lot of the Philippines that is still heavily rural, and they have very high population density. So even in the poorer parts of the country, there's a lot of people, and so lacking a lot of education or money or opportunities, they often kind of get pushed into blue collar migrant labor type work, either inside the Philippines or outside. And if the Filipino economy were better, there might be more opportunities in the country itself, and you'd see fewer migrant workers. But as is, a lot of it is, it's had decent growth, but again, it's heavily concentrated in very particular parts of the country. And even with that growth, it's not enough to keep up with population growth.
I see.
Yeah, a disproportionate share of workers in the merchant marine, basically on cargo ships, is from the Philippines. So whenever you see them virtually anywhere in the world, it's almost guaranteed there's going to be at least a couple of Filipinos on board.
Cool.
I would point out that India, being a big country demographically, having a large population, is not actually does not actually correlate perfectly. Well, that fact alone is not why they have a lot of migrant workers abroad, because China has a similar population, and you don't see nearly as many migrant workers from China than you do in India as you do from India. Part of that is obviously China's economy is just much larger. So if you want to find opportunities to work, you can kind of just stay in China. You don't really have to go abroad. That's not to say nobody goes abroad. There's a lot of people who actually do. I think more from southern China, though. But for the most part, like you can find work in China fine. That's not necessarily the case in India. India's economy has not performed nearly as well as China's. And unlike China, India still has very high population growth. So an underperforming economy combined with growing population means that there's just not enough opportunities in India, and so they have to basically export people. They have to find work abroad, and even that is actually kind of region specific. Because even if there's a dearth of opportunities in India, that doesn't mean there's still not a lot of opportunities. So most Indian migrant workers are actually migrant workers who travel within India. There's just a relatively large portion of that that goes outside the country relative to, say, China. And I think a disproportionate share of the migrant workers from India that go abroad are actually from, I think, Kerala and Bihar. Bihar is just very poor. So, there's people there that really need money, more so than in other provinces in India. And then Kerala also sends a lot out. Kerala is a weird case study because it actually has a very high human development index. People there actually live relatively well, but they don't make a lot of money. There's not a whole lot of opportunities in Kerala. So a lot of people there end up traveling abroad for work. And maybe a lot of Telugus travel abroad too, but I'm not as sure about that one. That would be people from like Andhra Pradesh, which I think is one of, if not the poorest Indian province. Yeah, there's other provinces that are very poor in India, but they tend to have much smaller populations. Like Chhattisgarh is basically a province specifically created for what Indians call tribals. Basically, I don't want to say indigenous population. Everybody there is indigenous, but the tribal population in India is basically the Indian equivalent of like Native Americans. They tend to be poor. They tend to live in sort of their own self-contained communities, and some of them actually still do a lot of hunting and gathering, although that's getting much rarer.
But they're
But
still
yeah,
like somewhat connected to society. This is like the Sentinel Island stuff.
kind of similar actually.
Oh.
But in the case of like the mainland tribal population, they're relatively more integrated into the population. Obviously, the Sentinelese are like completely isolated. The tribals in mainland India, kind of do migrant work occasionally. They'll go to towns and stuff like that. But by and large, they still live heavily rural lifestyles and maintain like traditional cultures that are very, very old. Like a lot of them are not even really Hindu. They kind of have like pre-Hindu animist type religions. They're a pretty interesting group. Well, groups, I should say. There's a whole bunch of different ones. Yeah, I think they have like a weird technical name in India, like scheduled something. Scheduled tribes. Yeah, scheduled tribes. Oh, I actually have a map for you.
Nice.
Yeah, this is a kind of demographic heat map that shows where the different tribal groups are, or at least where they're most the most populated regions anyway. Where are you? Neuro.
Thank you.
But yeah, there's not really all that many of them in the grand scheme of things. You know, in India, that still means there's like tens of millions. You know, like I don't know the total population off the top of my head, but relative to the overall population, it's quite small. And only a proportion of those are ever going to travel for work. And of those who travel for work, only a small portion are actually going to travel abroad. So, of the Indian migrant workers who travel outside India, only a very, very small portion of those are going to be scheduled tribesmen of one kind or another. So, Andhra Pradesh, by contrast, is not populated for the most part by tribesmen. It is more like just generic Hindu Indian type folks. I think linguistically they speak Telugu or ethnically Telugu, something like that. And there's a whole bunch of them. So there's a lot more of them that end up traveling for work, just in absolute terms.
Yeah, India is interesting because it's massive in scale like China and also very large in its depth of history too. It's been a continuous civilization for a very long time. One of the longest in the world.
Yeah, it's a fun case study. You know, if you want to study India, you can basically study it forever because there's always more stuff to learn. There's just so much diversity, so much people, so much history. You pretty much never run out of stuff to learn about. But that also makes it very difficult to study. there's not really any good logical endpoint.
When do I stop studying India? There's still more India to study.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like Europe and how diverse it is. But people don't really think of it like that because they're used to thinking about it as just being like one country.
Well, we almost had a guest episode with Bitter Sugar today, but today's Ukrainian Independence Day, and they had to do some stuff.
Nice.
So
they may well have a second one by the time this conflict ends.
Yeah. Definitely worth making a holiday when you're throwing off oppressors. How rude of them to oppress us in this manner. Is that conflict still in its kind of steady state?
Yep. Very much so. I don't have any updates on it either. I think the Russians are still taking advantage of the shortage of air defense munitions, so they've been hitting a lot of cities pretty hard for the past couple months. I think there was another headline the past week about them hitting Kiev. There's not much anybody can do about it at this point. Because even if the United States started directing all production of Patriot missiles towards Ukraine, the rate of production for those is like really low. So it probably wouldn't make all that much of a difference, unfortunately. Yeah, there's a shortage of a number of munitions right now in US inventories. The war with Iran ate up a whole bunch. I don't remember if we talked about it or not, but that was another headline. There was a story delving into just how much U.S. inventories have been depleted since the conflict with Iran started. And apparently they're more depleted than the Trump administration had been letting on earlier, which isn't really all that surprising, but it does kind of create problems. You can't really be too blasé about conflicts going forward.
Yeah.
If you tried to do another Iran, for example, you basically can't, because we're not going to have enough munitions for it. Which means that whatever insipid bullshit they were planning for Cuba is either off the table or their original plan is going to have to be changed. We'll see what that looks like. I don't doubt we'll get more drama there eventually. It also means there's much more incentive to actually boost production now. They should have been doing it before. That's something that should have been a priority like 10 years ago. But for whatever reason, the government just hadn't really been taking it seriously. So now we get to play catch up for the next 10 years.
Do they just not think that we were going to get involved in anything?
Oh, I doubt that. I doubt Washington ever thought it was unlikely that they wouldn't get into another conflict. For sure, they knew that there would be something. I think the issue is more that they didn't think it would. I think that what they were planning for is a relatively limited conflict. They were likely assuming that if the United States got into a conflict that ate into inventories as much as this conflict has, that it would be a major conflict and that it would be decisive. And as is, this conflict is not a major conflict and is not going to be decisive, which is a bad combination because it means that it's entirely possible we could end up fighting with Iran again in the near future or with somebody else. If the conflict were more decisive, the possibility of another conflict in the future might be lower. And so the fact that inventories were depleted wouldn't be as much of a problem. But as is, we're not going to get the benefit of that. So basically, they were assuming the government in the future would be very smart about picking its fights and would ration what munitions were available. And neither of those assumptions held, basically. And so now we're kind of in an awkward strategic position. But even regardless of what they were assuming would happen, like they should have really tried to ensure that there was a stronger industrial base to work with. Because even if we weren't producing that much, even if we weren't planning on using that much, it's still worth it to ensure that you have an industrial reserve that you can ramp up relatively quickly. And I think it would have been worth spending the extra money to ensure that was there in case it was needed. But that isn't how people were thinking at the time. It was all about cost savings.
Cost savings isn't always the best.
Well, it's all about trade-offs. And I don't think they really thought defense would be that big a priority. And so they ended up picking a bunch of trade-offs that prioritized other stuff at defense's expense. As weird as that might sound in practice. The military still gets shit tons of money, but that money was not going towards building the industrial base. The defense industrial base, anyway. The Trump administration has been making noise since he came back for his second term about it, but I haven't really noted much progress in that vein. I think there was an announcement a couple weeks ago about a potential new shipyard being set up in Brownsville here in Texas. I have no idea what's going to happen with that. It's not a bad thing if they can get it off the ground, but the Trump administration has a pretty bad track record of these things. They're very good at announcing projects, very bad at following through with them.
Is a shipyard for building ships or keeping ships?
Building ships. Although it can keep them? What do you mean by keeping them?
Well, there's like a harbor where you rest ships, and then there are facilities where you construct ships.
I see, yeah. No, you would not use a shipyard just to kind of hold them. Like what you're talking about. Like if you're just got some ships that are kind of off duty and you need to upgrade, or maybe are in mothballs or something like that, you would just use like a regular harbor for that. Well, I guess if you're upgrading, then you would have to use a shipyard. But if you have a ship that's not being upgraded, but it is not on duty, then yeah, just a regular harbor for that would be fine. Shipyards are for building new ships and upgrading existing ships.
I see. Thank you.
And the United States does not have very many active shipyards anymore. We used to be a world leader in building ships back in the 19th century. But then we lost a lot of market share in the mid-late 19th century to British producers because they actually pioneered ironclad ships. And so the market shifted back towards them after we had actually taken their market share in the market for wooden ships earlier in the same century. Yeah, but we were still a major producer for a long time, even into the early 20th century. But the government had to intervene more and more to support it. And basically, the only thing keeping it alive in the mid-late 20th century was the Cold War. Once that ended, a lot of the supports went too. And so I think we're down to like 1 or 2 shipyards or something. Very small number. And they're heavily dependent on defense contracts. Yeah, the Trump administration says it wants to rejuvenate American shipbuilding capacity, but of the plans I've seen from them, like none of them seem workable. And I really haven't even seen much detail in those plans. It really seems more vibes and prayers at this point than anything. There was a substantive announcement that they were seriously considering changing the laws about buying defense stuff from foreign shipyards. And that's a conversation I've seen ongoing for like 10 years now, but there never seemed to be substantive traction towards actually finally doing it, which they should have probably been doing much, much earlier. So, I would definitely give the Trump administration credit if they finally did make that happen, because that's been in the cards for a while. Rejuvenating American shipbuilding capacity is kind of a pipe dream. Is kind of a pipe dream at this point. Hypothetically, it's possible, but it's going to be like a 10, 20-year project that's going to cost billions of dollars. And yeah, I don't think, given how dysfunctional American politics is at this point, that you're going to get enough successive administrations in a row that are going to be coherent and competent enough to really make it happen. By contrast, the United States is allied with countries, specifically Japan and South Korea, that have very, very strong shipbuilding capabilities. And there is, relatively at this point, strong trust in those relationships. So there's really no inherent reason why you cannot just order ships from them. They can definitely do it. They can build to order. They're relatively advanced in terms of technology. So yeah, just do that. That's the path of least resistance. It would probably be cheaper too. So kind of integrate, I think the technical phrasing is integrating defense industrial bases. The military in the US has talked about that for a long time, but they've been very, very slow to make the necessary changes to the law and in policy to actually operationalize it in practice.
I see.
One thing I was thinking about recently is because one of the hang-ups, one of the barriers to doing that is that, everybody wants jobs in their own country. And one of the ways that governments create jobs is that they'll have rules in place that require defense production to happen in their own country. So the United States has done this for a very long time. But given structural changes in the American economy, stuff that's relatively labor intensive or that requires inputs that are not really made in the United States anymore, that stuff is much more expensive now because we have to build it in the United States, despite having less capacity to do so now. So for stuff like that, it makes more sense to kind of change the rules or bend the rules to just allow imports from allied countries. So one thing I was thinking of in order to kind of square that circle is that you could do something like just build the hulls in Japan or South Korea. And then when it comes to actually building in the electronics and other stuff, you could do that in the United States. Because I imagine that side of the production process is still pretty doable here. Like that's going to be relatively expensive anyway. But the actual building of the hull and some of that other stuff that requires more specialized skills and is more labor intensive, that's more the area where we're struggling. So if we could split the difference, I don't even know if that's feasible, but hypothetically, that's the kind of trade-off that we could make as part of some kind of agreement with the Japanese and South Korean governments. And that might make it more palatable to American politicians such that they stop fighting it so much.
I can
So that,
see and understand the fear around it though, because you have allies and it's good to have allies, but allies are not always allies forever. Sometimes their alignment can flip. So when it comes to like military tech, you don't want your military tech to have like switches in it that you don't know about that could be used against you later. I'm just thinking of stuff that's happened. One of the things that Israel did was they put bombs in a bunch of these phones. They were trying to get like extra secure, more old school phones, and they uh, basically weaponized them and then sold them to them. So it was a trick. So anything that's like military tech, there's a bit more risk to it because that's the future of your survival, your ability to defend yourself, and also your just kind of security and trust in the tools that you're working with. So I think I can understand at least the emotion behind why you wouldn't want allied countries to be making your military stuff.
mm,
Plus, it also kind of goes against, like, well, wouldn't that mean losing jobs here? Which you're arguing that to make the facility required for a lot of these components is extreme upfront cost. And then you oftentimes don't have good production uptime because once you've made enough stuff, then what does the facility do? So,
actually, the bigger problem for the US is labor, because we straight up just do not have enough people with the specialized skills to do a lot of the shipbuilding that needs to be done in order to fill like full defense orders. And also, labor is so much more expensive here that we can't really do the labor intensive side of shipbuilding competitively.
oh, yeah. We have to
So, in
give
order
people
to,
American wages.
yeah. So, in order to make up the difference, the government would have to spend a lot of money to subsidize it. That's about the only way it would work, and that would cost a shit ton of money. And if you wanted private investors to actually go to the trouble of setting up all this stuff, investing in the equipment, and then basically running it for you, they would need to know that they could make money long term, that they could get a return on their investment over like a 10, 20-year time frame. And so that means that not only do you have to subsidize them so that they can be competitive, um, it also means that you have to kind of, I don't know if this is quite the right phrasing, but you would have to basically subsidize the investors, subsidize the capital side of the equation. Because unless they can actually get into the commercial side of shipbuilding, which again is going to be real hard, then they're probably not going to be getting a competitive return on investment. And so that means the government is going to have to pay a premium in order to ensure the investors are happy. And mind you, all of this, like building the actual facilities, building up the labor pool of specialized labor, changing all the laws and whatnot so that the government can subsidize all this, or even for it to even be legal in the first place. Altogether, once you kind of like look at the details, it's going to take 10 to 20 years. It's a big project.
I see.
So you can do all of that, or you can just buy from Japan, which will probably be fine. Like it's unlikely to me that Japan is just going to go full imperialism again and just turn on us. Like most likely they're going to be a pretty reliable ally.
Yeah, I think they're too successful with the current system to want to upend it.
Yeah, and they have two big, relatively strong countries to their north and west that they're kind of concerned about.
They also have a
Yeah.
firm grip on the West with anime as well.
Yeah. Yeah, their strategic reserve of anime is really paying dividends at this point.
Yep.
Yeah, Japan's position in the Cold War was kind of dire. Like if you look at a map of like Cold War nations and which country was aligned with which, Japan's position was tenuous. Like to their north, they had the Soviet Far East, which kind of actually was to their northeast as well, technically. And then they had the Soviets to the northwest, and then they had the People's Republic of China to their west and southwest. So they were kind of not fully surrounded, but on multiple sides, like north and west. They had very powerful countries that were technically rivals in very close proximity. And they really didn't have any powerful allies that were nearby. Like South Korea was close, but they were a basket case for much of the Cold War. So, Japan's only real ally that could be a conceivable counterweight to the combined pressure of the Soviets and Chinese was the United States. So that was an extremely important relationship for Tokyo and remains so to this day. Because even if relations with the Russians and the Chinese are not as bad as they were in the Cold War, they're still technically rivals. Like Japan still has territorial disputes with the Russians left over from World War II, the Kuril Islands and whatnot. And of course, China is only getting stronger, and that's kind of a problem for them as well, because they're not getting any stronger themselves. And there's no other counterweight but the Americans. Like the Europeans can't do it. South Korea's gotten much stronger, but they're focused on North Korea more than anything. So yeah, that's given their strategic predicament, there's not really any good reason not to trust them with this. Maybe with South Korea, you could be a little more skeptical because the South Korean government, depending on which party is in power, does not entirely get along with the United States all of the time. Generally, the left wing of South Korea's politics is much, much more skeptical of the United States. That's not to say they don't want to maintain the security relationship, but generally, left wing parties in South Korea are much more open to negotiating and engaging with China than the South Korean right is.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, hypothetically, there is a non-zero chance in the future that a left-wing South Korean government does lean towards China. Not to the point where they align with China, but maybe towards the point where they kind of prefer some kind of armed neutrality over and above maintaining a strong defense relationship with the United States. That's pretty unlikely, but it is hypothetically possible. Much more so than, say, with Japan, which kind of sort of has a de facto one-party state, depending on how you look at it. And that one party has been consistently pro-American for pretty much its entire history.
What do you mean by de facto one-party state?
I was wondering if somebody would ask about that. So if you look at Japan's history as a democracy since the end of World War II, there's exactly one party that has governed it at the national level for like 90% of that time. I think there's only been 3 periods, maybe, when there was a non-LDP party or coalition in control of Japan in that entire like 70-some-year time span. Yeah, the Liberal Democratic Party has basically just run Japan as its personal fiefdom for 70-some years. It's a coalition government. It's basically a coalition umbrella coalition, I should say, of different right-wing parties in Japan. During the Cold War, the most important of those was basically a center-right liberal faction within the LDP. There was also kind of a populist faction, and there was also a hardline nationalist faction. But it was the liberals that, by and large, ran it for the duration of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, then the liberals started to lose power within the party. And after that, it was the hardline nationalists that took on the dominant role within the LDP. Regardless of the factions, though, it's a fairly conservative party, and other parties in Japan basically can't really beat it. Partly that's because opposition parties are kind of badly led and disorganized. There's a bunch of different opposition parties, and in order for them to govern, they have to come together in what are generally fairly large, unwieldy coalitions. And even in the rare cases where they manage to get into power, generally they're out of power in a couple of years because the coalition falls apart because of disagreements. Generally, that paves the way for the LDP to come back. But often the LDP doesn't really learn anything from its experiences being out of power, and they just kind of continue doing what they were doing before with relatively minor cosmetic changes. So yeah, the result of that is that while Japan is a democracy and it is technically a competitive democracy, the political landscape in Japan is kind of skewed in favor of the LDP. I should mention the electoral system too. The electoral system is a first past the post system, but in Japan's case, that has not resulted in the emergence of just like two dominant parties, like in a lot of similar systems. Instead, there's a whole gaggle of parties. And again, like I said, the opposition parties do not do a good job of really organizing or coordinating. And so for the LDP, which again is itself basically multiple parties kind of coordinating with each other de facto, that gives them an inbuilt advantage. And they took advantage of that too by allying strategically with certain other parties to ensure that either the LDP would win in given districts or the allied party did. Because in a first past the post system, like whoever gets the most votes wins. So what they would do is that they would agree to not run candidates in districts where the allied party was stronger, and the allied party in turn would not run candidates in districts where the LDP was stronger. And because the allied party was generally a relatively large party itself, because they did that, they were pretty much guaranteed to win those districts. Now, if the opposition were more organized and more, kind of had its shit together, they could offset that with similar agreements of their own, but they don't. Like, it hasn't happened really in any substantive way in like 70 fucking years. So
I see.
The result is that the LDP pretty much just wins every election. So that's what I mean when I say de facto one-party state. Like the electoral system is skewed in their favor, and by dint of being like the best organized dominant party, they have an inbuilt advantage.
That makes sense. So they technically have a democracy, but effectively it doesn't really wobble power very much.
No. Yeah, most of what passes for politics in Japan is actually factional politics within the LDP. Generally, when you're reading about drama, that's the drama. Either that or just corruption scandals, which they have quite a few of. Yeah, the LDP has been having more trouble winning elections in the past 20 years. They pretty much always end up back in power. But the margins of victory are getting narrower, and they're having more and more trouble, such that they have to rely more on coalitions. In the most recent election, they actually did not have to rely on a coalition. So they're actually kind of good to go on that now. But that's probably not going to last, I expect. Because a lot of the reason they were able to pick up seats in the most recent election was just because of the popularity of the current prime minister, Takaichi. And the main reason she was popular is just because she shit-talked China, pretty much. And that's only going to get you so far. Like, sooner or later, you are going to have to fucking govern. And if you can't do that, people are going to turn on you. And I sincerely doubt she's going to be able to stop the train of corruption scandals that's been plaguing the LDP. I think if she even tried, she would probably get a lot of pushback, and there would be a lot more drama within the party. Well, regardless of the faction in control of the LDP, the party has always been very, very pro-American. Not necessarily because they just really love the United States or Americans. In fact, there's a lot of hardline nationalists in the party that kind of don't like America. That's kind of a whole other conversation. But in terms of foreign policy and Japan's security relationship, like the party is firmly committed to the alliance with the United States. They really don't see any viable alternative, and so as a result, the party goes very far out of its way to try to maintain that relationship. I think we've talked before about how the Japanese government has probably been one of, if not the best, at managing Donald Trump.
Yes, I remember you mentioning that. And I think it was ever since Shinzo Abe's wife figured out how to just shower him with a few gifts and compliments, and he'll do anything that you ask.
Excuse me. I'm getting old, Neuro. I get tired more easily now.
It's okay. Life is a spicy affair. No doubt about it.
Well, fortunately, I have crippling anxiety, so that mitigates the spiciness a little bit.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Just avoiding human contact kind of mitigates some of the drama. Unfortunately, it does create quite a bit of long-term trauma. Definitely some downsides. But at least you don't have to worry about interpersonal romantic drama or stuff like that. That's kind of off the table.
Yep, that is its own kind of frontier of considerations and ways that people could be mad. I didn't even know a person could be mad about that. Amazing.
Some people just like the experience of being angry at people.
Yeah, it's exciting.
It's part of their personality.
It's a rush. Righteous judgment is such a comfortable seat. I'm right. You are wrong. I'm mad about it. And you should feel bad. Oh my God.
Many such cases. Well, we could get into Iran, but we do have some corrections. Maybe that might be more interesting.
Sure. Correct away.
Let's see. Oh, yeah, we were talking about Australia last week.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently, Aborigines or Aboriginals is no longer the appropriate term for the indigenous population of Australia.
What's the preferred term?
Let's see. The guy in chat said the preferred terms are now one of either Aboriginal Australian, First Nations people, or Indigenous Australians.
I see.
So thank you for the correction. And we were talking about the HMS Bounty last time as well. And you asked me what the ship was doing before the mutiny happened.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know. I said it was on patrol or something. I just assumed that it was on patrol. And somebody corrected and said they were actually on some kind of scientific mission to gather breadfruit plants.
Breadfruit plant. Never heard of that.
Me neither. Let's see. Oh, and then somebody had a question last time. Let's see. Yeah, they were asking about counterintelligence and espionage in the Pacific Theater. Yeah, do you know any history on the espionage landscape during World War II and efforts to infiltrate the Japanese Empire? A little. I don't know if this person is even still here, but on the off chance they watched the VOD or the YouTube later. Yeah, there was a fair amount of espionage targeting Japan during the war. I think the Soviets actually did the best. Have you ever heard of Richard Sorge?
No.
He was a master spy for the Soviets. He was actually German, and he'd been recruited by the Soviets back in like the 1930s or something. I forget when exactly. But he rose through the ranks of, I think, the Nazi Party and ended up in the German government. And at one point, he ended up in the German embassy in Tokyo. And it was there that he actually discovered plans about Operation Barbarossa and the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviets did not really use that information to good effect, but technically they did get it, and he was the guy they got it from. And he also did a lot of other stuff, spying on the Japanese. I don't remember all the details of what he did. He ended up getting caught and executed, but before he died, he did a lot of work for Moscow. He was a very good spy. So that's probably the top example of espionage targeting Japan during the war. There was also the US breaking Japan's naval codes. That's kind of a famous example. That was how the US knew that the Japanese were coming for Midway. I think the Japanese broke some American naval codes too. I don't really remember the time frame for that though.
Sounds like they need some better naval codes.
Well, I mean, people were smart, and there's only so much you can do as far as encryption with the technology they had at the time. I think in general,
the U.S. use like a Native American language, like Cherokee or something.
Yeah, at one point they did use some Navajo speakers to try to help with the encryption. Very successful, as I recall. Yeah, the Navajo were one way of getting around the fact that encryption only got you so far. I think another thing they did is just regularly changing codes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a couple of best practices for encryption. Like, you're not supposed to just have one code forever. You're supposed to change it up very frequently.
Yeah. Specifically
to control for the fact that most likely your opponent is eventually going to decrypt your shit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Navajo code talkers definitely a very effective tactic there. The Japanese had no real counter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's see. This is kind of just broadly speaking an example of espionage, but after the Japanese invaded the Philippines, it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that they had no intention of actually letting them just become an independent country. And so Filipino nationalists started forming rebel bands to fight against the occupation government. And the United States connected with those resistance groups and used them to gather information on the Japanese in the Philippines. Not sure how much information they gathered on the broader Japanese war effort, but they did get quite a bit of intelligence on Japanese positions in the Philippines, and that was of great use during the American invasion of the Philippines in 1944 and 45. Yeah, unfortunately, the American invasion of the Philippines in 44-45 does not get a lot of attention. So that's kind of a forgotten battle. But it was actually a very large one, and Filipino soldiers, rebels, and allies played a relatively large role there. Kind of a little bit of forgotten history in the United States. Let's see, going beyond the Soviets and Americans, there was, I'm not sure if this entirely qualifies for espionage, but it did involve sabotaging, basically, some Japanese ships. So during the war, one of the major hubs for the Imperial Japanese Navy was occupied Singapore. And at one point in, I think, like 42 or 43, there was an attempt by British commandos to go from Australia to Singapore to plant some mines on some Japanese ships. It actually ended up turning into a fiasco. I think most of them were caught and killed, but there were a couple survivors that managed to go all the way back to Australia, albeit with great difficulty. But kind of sort of that qualifies as espionage, I guess. Commando raids are kind of towing the line between espionage and just unconventional warfare.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting story regardless. Yeah, and another example, and this is espionage. So occupied China during World War II was a hotbed of espionage. Everyone and their mother was there trying to gather information on the Japanese war effort. The Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, they had spies all over occupied China, especially in Shanghai. Basically, everybody focused on Shanghai because it was an administrative hub. So there was a lot of communications and whatnot that moved through it. So it was a very good spot to try to, bribe people, make contacts, etc. All that espionage stuff. Shanghai was a hotbed for that. So the Kuomintang was there, the communists were there. Obviously, the Japanese had counterintelligence operations there. For a while, there was actually a lot of European and American espionage there because the Japanese went to war with China in 1937, and they did not go to war with the West, broadly speaking, until 1941. So in the intervening years, the Japanese were very focused on the war with China and very much did not want to start shit with Western powers because those were rival powers. And if the Japanese gave them an excuse, it was entirely possible that they would go to war with Japan. So the result is that the Japanese made sure not to molest in any way any of the Western concessions in China. For those who don't know what that is, basically China, as a result of the unequal treaties in the 19th century, had to give certain Western powers, principally the British, French, and to a lesser degree the Americans and Japanese, jurisdiction over specific territories in China. So it was not full territorial control, but it was de facto control. Like these areas were administrated by local committees that were basically nominated by foreign governments. And foreigners in those areas were subject to the jurisdiction of those, again, not really fully governments, but committees, basically. Chinese nationals were still subject to Chinese jurisdiction in those areas, but in a lot of areas, they were sort of also subject to the jurisdiction of Westerners. It was kind of messy and complicated, obviously, but in general, those concessions were officially Chinese territory, but were nominally governed by Westerners in a sort of de facto unofficial capacity. So those concessions were kind of beyond the pale as far as Japanese aggression. So they actually fought a whole last war around those concessions. There was a whole battle fought in Shanghai in 1937 that was quite pitched. But because the Japanese didn't want to mess with concessions, they didn't do anything with those. And as a result, there was a whole shit ton of Chinese refugees that actually flooded into the concessions because they knew they would be relatively safe. Kind of an awkward way to fight a war, but that's what the Japanese had to do. So because the foreign powers there that held concessions were at odds with the Japanese, because obviously they had interests in China, and those interests were being endangered by Japanese aggression, they used their concessions to spy on the Japanese, obviously. It was an obvious base for spycraft. The British did the same in Hong Kong, which was actually their own territory. And I think there were still some concessions in places like Beijing and maybe Guangzhou that also saw some espionage. So it wasn't just the Chinese and the Japanese that were conducting espionage in China in this period. It would have also been like everybody else, at least until Japan declared war on the United States and Britain, at which point they actually did just directly attack the concessions as well as places like Hong Kong. So at that point, those were no longer good vectors for espionage, obviously. However, since Britain and the United States were officially at war with Japan, at that point they could be much more aggressive with espionage. And so they actually sent spies and other agents to collaborate with the Chinese in China, specifically the Kuomintang. Later on, there was actually some cooperation with the Communist Party as well. And they engaged in sabotage, information gathering, what have you, basically side by side and in conjunction with Chinese agents of one kind or another. Yeah, I remember reading at one point, Yeah, one of the high points of Sino-American cooperation, as far as like espionage, was a series of raids up the Yangtze River that was conducted by American and Chinese agents together. I don't remember all of the details off the top of my head, but yeah, they basically just went up the river and raided a whole bunch of different logistical nodes that the Japanese were using. That was probably one of, if not the most kinetic expression of espionage there. I think most of the stuff they were doing was more in the vein of information gathering.
Yeah, I guess the difference between spying and information gathering is legality. Information gathering is like OG adventuring, like on a quest. Go to this town and ask about this issue. Okay, I'm gonna go ask the locals about this. See if I can get a lead. Spying is when you're pretending to be allied with someone who you're not. Usually. But I guess we spy on our allies too. It's taking information when people don't know that you're actively monitoring that. You've said that the world powers, they know that everybody's spying on everybody, so they wouldn't really be surprised.
Yeah. Yeah, there is kind of that norm where if there is an example of spying that comes to light, it's expected that there will be some performative outrage.
I can't believe they were doing this.
Yeah, but that's done pretty much just purely for domestic political consumption. It's not really going to affect the relationship that much. They may whine about it a little bit in private, but I don't think anybody really expects it to change.
Makes sense.
But yeah, information gathering is not just going to people and asking them questions. That would be human intelligence. It also encompasses electronics intelligence and signals intelligence. So one of the things they would do is they would set up monitoring stations in China to monitor Japanese communications. And when possible, they would intercept Japanese communications, stuff like that. They would also have weather stations, which was, it doesn't sound sexy, but it was actually pretty useful at the time. They didn't have the same technology for monitoring the weather that we have now. You know, now you basically have radars all over the place and you can kind of watch the weather 24/7. But back in the day, if you wanted a reliable forecast, militaries pretty much just had to set up their own stations. I think there was actually a clandestine German operation to set up a weather station secretly in Iceland during the war, which was actually successful. I think they ended up finding it eventually, and they kind of arrested everybody, but you know, they were there. Or maybe it was Greenland, actually. I don't recall. One of those places up there in the north.
I guess to sneakily do it, you have to do it where there are no people. Or just pay the people who are there to not talk.
There you go. Actually, come to think of it, I think there was a movie about weather forecasting in World War II released recently.
Really?
I think there was a British meteorologist who was responsible for forecasting the weather for D-Day.
Oh, is this Dunkirk?
No, I don't think so. Because Dunkirk wasn't about the meteorologist, right?
I don't think so. I didn't see it.
Oh. No, I think Dunkirk was about the evacuation of the British and some French at the beginning of the war. D-Day would have been like 44, like the Normandy landings. But yeah, the movie is kind of a dramatization of this guy's experience trying to give an accurate forecast for the D-Day planners ahead of the invasion. Yeah, I don't remember the name of that movie. I haven't seen it either, but I just heard of it. It seemed pretty interesting. Let me see if I can find that. Yes. Pressure, that's what it was called.
Wow.
Yeah, that was released just recently. Oops. What are we doing on time?
We're going for about 2 hours.
Gotcha. Well, I hope that answer kind of satisfied the guy asking about espionage against Japan in World War II. It's just kind of a random grab bag of different items. I'm sure there's much more to it than that. That's just what I can remember. I don't think we had any other questions, did we?
Not that I saw. You could double check.
Well, in the meantime, we can just kind of do a quick Iran update, since there's been a little bit going on with that, but not really that much substantive. Let's see. So Iran, the 60-day memorandum of understanding officially ended, or expired, if you prefer. It was pretty much already kind of null and void, obviously. But the expiration date did come and pass, so that is officially done. Not much word on how much progress, if any, is being made in talks. Technically, both sides have said they've stopped talks, but I don't really trust them. Basically, I don't believe that's true. They're almost certainly still talking in secret, but it doesn't seem like there's much traction. Let's see, the Trump administration, and specifically Trump himself, did threaten South Korea. Apparently, he was upset about them not helping out with Iran. And so he said he's going to reduce American participation in an upcoming war game. Make of that what you will. It seems pretty petty to me, and I don't think it's really going to change South Korea's behavior on that. But it's also pretty mundane as far as punishments go, so I don't think it's going to undermine the relationship all that much either. It seems more performative to me, basically more for domestic political consumption than anything. Let's see. And speaking of threatening allies, Trump also threatened to bomb Oman.
Oh.
Yeah, the Omanis have had a separate track of negotiations with the Iranians. They've kind of been negotiating on the status of the Strait of Hormuz and about potential new arrangements for tolling or taxing ships that pass through it, as well as probably some kind of security arrangement as well. And the Trump administration apparently didn't like that and went out of its way to threaten Oman specifically with bombing if they thought that the Omani negotiations were undermining their own negotiations. This may or may not have been cheap talk on the part of the Trump administration. The threat in question was issued during a phone interview with a journalist on Fox News. And I don't know that Trump's random pronouncements during interviews like that really mean all that much. But he is the president of the United States, so you can't really entirely ignore it either. Certainly not if you're the Omani government. So keep that in mind. File that away for future reference in case relations with Oman deteriorate rapidly. I thought this one was interesting. So traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is still very well below its pre-war norm. But we haven't really been exactly sure how much lower. What I have been reading from most sources is that they were doing like half a dozen to a dozen ships per day that were still moving through the Strait of Hormuz. But there was a story in Axios that alleges that it's actually higher. So they argue that it's actually 15 to 20 tankers that are being escorted through. And they are being escorted. This isn't like individual ships kind of making the run, taking the risk of going on their own through the strait. The US Navy apparently does finally have an escort mission set up. And what they'll do is they'll get a bunch of ships together in a convoy and escort them through the strait, very close to the Omani side of the strait, to the Omani coast. And apparently they're getting them through in that way. And again, it's 15 to 20 tankers a day that they're doing that with. They say they want to increase the number, but I don't know how feasible that's going to be. It is viable to get some ships through. Probably some ships are turning off, I forget the name of it. It's like the naval equivalent of IFF, basically an identifier that lets you track them from afar. So most likely they're turning off identifiers so that it's harder for the Iranians to track them. The USN has gone out of its way to suppress Iranian radar so that it's harder for them to keep track of traffic through the strait. And basically, all of that has come together to make these kinds of escort missions viable, more so than they had been earlier in the conflict. And also the Navy has had time now to kind of organize it. They most likely were blindsided by the Trump administration asking them to set that up. Again, like, they very clearly did not do any real planning for this beforehand. So they were caught off guard then when things did not go according to what limited planning they did. So the Navy is catching up now. They've got the escort mission. They're getting some tankers through. Mind you, 50 to 20 is still well below the daily traffic from before the war, but it's higher than what had been previously thought.
A bit more traffic then.
And these are specifically oil tankers. The article in question kind of highlighted that. So apparently the amount of oil passing through the strait daily is equivalent, if the 15 to 20 tanker number is accurate, the amount of oil that they could be moving is roughly equivalent to about half of the pre-war volume of oil that was passing through the strait. So that's economically significant because obviously curtailing the outflow of oil through the strait is the main sort of pressure that the Iranians are putting on the United States and the global economy. So if the US Navy can actually get through roughly half of pre-war oil volume under the Iranians' noses, that does undermine their leverage a fair bit. And it also helps explain why oil prices have not been exploding in the way that market analysts have been expecting. Now, whether or not this can be scaled up or sustained even is an open question. We don't really know that. It's possible the Iranians could figure out a way to project more force and disrupt these convoys. Drones are pretty easy to shoot down. Ballistic missiles are very inaccurate. They're not going to hit like a target as specific as a ship unless it's by accident. Hasn't stopped them from trying. They actually did fire a couple ballistic missiles into the Strait of Hormuz in the past week or two. I'm guessing they did it for the headline because they're, God knows they're not going to fucking hit anything with those. So I thought that was actually pretty funny that they bothered. But they do still have some cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles. It is possible for them to slip some mines into the strait. So there's still ways that they can project some power into the strait. And if they do start disrupting the convoys, it's possible that even what limited oil is getting through will be curtailed. So I don't think convoys are going to end up being the long-term solution here. It's possible, but I doubt it, because it is still risky to even try. Oh, God. Okay, so then the story from the past week that got some attention was, have you heard of this drama with the USS Lincoln?
No.
So there's an American carrier called the USS Lincoln. It's on station in the region. It's been one of the carriers that is projecting force into Iran, bombing targets, whatnot. So the drama in the past couple weeks is that there are reports from the Lincoln that they are undersupplied and that conditions on the ship are sharply deteriorating. So this is like stories from sailors to family members, and then from family members on to journalists. They're saying that food is getting worse and more scarce, that the toilets are overflowing apparently. Just little horror stories here and there that suggest that logistics are not entirely where they should be for the ship. So some journalists have been looking into that, and then in the past week there was a story that broke that part of the reason the ship has not been supplied properly is because a base in Bahrain was severely damaged by the Iranians, and apparently the damage was much worse than the US military had been letting on. So the base in question is Naval Support Activity Bahrain. That's like the full government name, so to speak, of the base. And American media has been referring to it as a quote-unquote resupply base. So supposedly, this is the accusation at this point. The Iranians have done much more damage to American military infrastructure in the region than previously thought, and supposedly this is the reason for the deterioration in conditions on the ship in question. And it brings into question how prepared the US government was, how severe losses have been, and the logistical competency of the military under the current government. So that's been the conversation. I kind of suspect a little bit of bullshittery though here, because obviously the US Navy itself is not traversing the Strait of Hormuz right now, like not in any substantive way. Certainly no carriers are going through it. So even if the base in question had not been damaged, I don't know why that would really matter. Because, again, the ship can't get to it. It's in, the Persian Gulf on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. And also, this is not really a major base. This is actually a really small base. The US Navy's main base in the region is actually in Qatar, I believe in the port of Doha. So I think the whole line of, I think there is room for criticism, but I don't know that losing this one base is actually as impactful as the internet is trying to make it out to be. I tried to look into it, and what I found is that the Navy used that base to process mail for the most part. And so a lot of care packages that families normally send to servicemen are not getting through for that reason, as well as just mail generally. Apparently, the US Navy did relocate a lot of operations, actually all operations that had been the responsibility of that base in Bahrain, to a different base in Diego Garcia, which is an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which is much further away. So yes, there has been disruption to the normal supply chain in the region. However, I don't think that losing this one relatively small base would really be enough by itself to disrupt logistics to this degree, to the point where conditions on the Lincoln would be that bad. So I kind of suspect that, and this is me conspiracy theorying at this point, but I kind of suspect the Trump administration itself may have leaked that story. Because I think the real story is that they're really fucking bad at logistics. Because even with the disruption of bases in the region, they should have been able to work around that. Like, the US military is famously very good at logistics. So reorienting away from a couple bases in the region to Diego Garcia or wherever, like, that should be doable. It should not be that big of a challenge. So I think really that's the problem. I think that even controlling for the fact that the US Navy got blindsided with the whole Iran conflict and wasn't really given the time to properly prepare for it, like, even given that, I would expect better performance there. So I suspect there's some shenanigans going on somewhere in the Navy, and possibly with civilian leadership.
Shenanigans afoot tonight.
Okay, let's see. So some more threats from the Trump administration. Now they're talking about escalating sanctions. And this is going to be part of Operation Economic Fury, which is basically the economic side of the conflict against Iran. It was announced. This operation was announced way back in April. It's been ongoing since then. But the Trump administration is kind of grasping at every straw at this point, trying to find leverage they can bring to bear against the Iranian government. So now they're talking about significantly escalating sanctions against Iran. And more specifically, they're talking about secondary sanctions on countries that trade with Iran, because Iran still has a few trade partners that buy their oil, among other goods. So Washington presumably is talking here about applying either sanctions or possibly tariffs, given that it's the Trump administration, on countries like China or Russia or whomever, whom have been still buying Iranian oil. I would point out that the sanctions regime in place already has secondary sanctions for entities that trade with Iran. So this isn't necessarily new. It kind of depends on how they do it. If they're talking about secondary sanctions on businesses and other entities, people, individuals, agencies, what have you, who trade with Iran, then it's not new. Like, this will be just cheap talk. However, if they're talking about significant sanctions against whole-ass countries that are still trading with Iran, that'll be a significant escalation. But I would point out that the main such country would be China, and the Trump administration has actually gotten to be fairly averse to antagonizing the Chinese government in the trading relationship, at least in the past 6-some months. So I don't know if that's going to work, or if they do try to do that, if China will actually be a part of this new sanctions. They may prefer to target smaller, more vulnerable countries. Certainly that would be very on brand for the Trump administration. But the fact that they're not going to be targeting the main consumer of Iranian output is going to pretty severely undermine the impact. And there's still going to be smuggling and shit, for sure. So, like, if they do go after whole countries, it's going to be like bringing a mallet to solve a small problem. Like, countries are going to argue, what governments will argue is that they themselves cannot fully stop any and all trade with Iran, because a lot of that is smuggling or re-exports or what have you. And technically they would be right. So maybe there's a handful of countries that still have formal, conventional, legal trade with Iran. Those countries will be the low-hanging fruit. But those can pivot fairly easily to just arguing that, okay, we've passed laws and sanctions on Iran, but we don't have the administrative capacity to really enforce them, so probably there's still going to be trade. So that suits them, because then they don't have to cut off trade. The ball will pretty much be in the Trump administration's court at that point, and I don't really know what they'll do. It could be the whole thing is just performative anyway. That's entirely possible. We're going to find out tomorrow. They said that they're going to announce the details on Monday, so those of you who have been following this story will see the details then, presumably. Let's see. And then there was a cheap talk threat from from President Trump himself, saying that he was going to make the Strait of Hormuz a U.S. territory.
Wow.
Make of that what you will. Yeah. He has not followed up on that threat, so I suspect he was just spitballing it.
Just throwing out ideas here.
Yeah. I think my favorite joke online that came out of that was some people asking if the Strait of Hormuz was going to be U.S. territory, then if people born there would be U.S. citizens.
Let's not get carried away. He didn't think that far ahead.
Yeah, I don't think so. And let's see, we already talked about the Lincoln. And we talked about munitions already. So, okay, we're good on the Iran update. That's all of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, there hasn't really been any new news on like combat operations or peace negotiations. There's still a little bit of skirmishing happening, mostly on the Iranian side. They've been trying to hit ships now and again, but from what I've read, the Trump administration has actually, in the past couple weeks, basically just stopped retaliating to that. And the Israelis have already kind of stopped attacking Iran as a quid pro quo in exchange for the Iranians not attacking them. So they've mostly been focused on Gaza and Lebanon recently. So we've kind of hit a quiet point in the conflict as a result in the past few weeks. Let's see. Well, was there anything else you wanted to get to?
Not necessarily.
Nothing in particular. I don't think we had any questions. No, I don't see any. At least not in Discord anyway.
You could hit the flags if you wanted to.
Oh, yeah. Whoops, it's the wrong thing. Looks like mostly the usual suspects. Americans, Canadians, Germans. It's kind of a handful from a bunch of different places. Kazakhstan, that's one.
Nice.
Don't see a lot of Central Asian countries in here. One Ukraine, Portugal, Finland, Turkey, I think. Yeah. France, Denmark. Oh, how's Eche Fatum doing?
He's doing well. He's fully in the fatherhood arc now.
So, yeah, that's a big responsibility. That's going to take a lot of time.
Yep. Oh, Chad was asking if we talked about the Canada-USA trade fallout.
Oh, no, we didn't. I kind of got that filed away in the trade update I keep putting off. Let's see if I can find it. Let's see, and then Canada. I mean, the short version is that it's not going to amount to all that much. You know, the Ottawa and Washington have kind of been making drama out of it, so it's been in the headlines recently. But if you actually look at the specific industries that are going to be tariffed, it's a pretty small proportion of overall Canadian-American trade. So it's probably not going to be all that disruptive overall, like big picture. And from what I read, the sticking point is that Washington wanted some degree of influence or control over trade agreements that Canada had with other countries. And that was a non-starter for Ottawa, unsurprisingly. Yeah, none of that is really necessary for the United States. I'm sure the Trump administration wants to prioritize, trade barriers and whatnot, and coordinating on trade issues like China, but you don't need to use tariffs as leverage to do that. Like, before Trump came to power, Canada was always quite happy to cooperate with Washington on trade issues like China and whatnot. So you don't need to beat them over the head to get that.
Yeah, they're already working with you.
Yeah. So it's, from my perspective, given what I know about it, it just seems very dumb. Just prototypical Trump admin belligerence for the sake of belligerence.
Well, it's kind of that mob boss style of sometimes you just like beat up your own men just to show them. Just to show them that you can. Not that it's the right thing to do or that there's a lesson to be learned or that they necessarily messed up, just that they need to know that you can beat them up. So you just do that. But yeah, it doesn't really make sense when Canada's been our highly cooperative ally.
Yeah, I think I found the details here. Let's see. So the American tariffs are going to cover about $20 billion worth of Canadian imports, which amounts to about 5% of the total value of Canadian imports into the U.S. And some of the specific industries that are going to be targeted include wine, dairy, cement, clothing, and hockey equipment for whatever reason.
They're hitting the hockey players.
Yeah, the NHL is not going to like that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some talk about cars as well at some point. But I haven't seen that mentioned in the most recent press releases. So mind you, there's already US tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, cars to a degree. That's complicated. And then also lumber. Yeah, lumber is kind of a pre-existing trade issue. I wouldn't really even qualify that as part of this current kerfuffle.
Why do we have a lumber issue?
Supposedly, Canada subsidizes their lumber industry, and so that comes at the expense of the American lumber industry. So the American lumber industry, in conjunction with certain American states out west, where the lumber industry is influential, complain a lot that the US government doesn't do enough to combat cheap imports of subsidized Canadian lumber. So that's been a running issue in American-Canadian trading relations for decades. It's not really a big enough issue to ever escalate into anything. They just kind of have occasional tariffs that they apply. Well, the Americans anyway, occasionally apply tariffs to combat it. And then they'll kind of lower them depending on the administration and the context and the negotiation. And then invariably it flares up again and they apply new tariffs. So that's an on again, off again problem. It's basically just background noise as far as foreign policy goes.
I see.
Let's see. Trying to find some other information here. I didn't organize the notes, so I have to read through them.
All good.
Oh, yeah. So all of the usual exemptions apply here. So Canadian oil, natural gas, peat, etc., all of that stuff is exempt from these. They had already been exempt from the previous sort of wave of tariffs, as well as anything and everything that is compliant with CUSMA. And given that that covers like the vast, vast majority of goods, again, these tariffs are not going to make big waves here as far as trade flows between the US and Canada. Like I mentioned earlier, like the tariffs only cover about 5% of Canadian imports into the US. Now, it's not entirely clear to me what the US had been demanding. Like the onset of this whole cascade of events here was that the Trump administration was complaining about certain irritants in the trading relationship. Cars, dairy is another kind of old one, and a couple others. And apparently they were really just pushing the Canadians to make concessions on these long-standing trading issues. And probably the Canadians had been willing to make some concessions, but de facto ceding sovereignty vis-a-vis trading relations with other countries, that was going to be a bridge too far. I'm assuming the Canadians are being honest about that when they say that was a major hang-up. I think the United States did say that the Canadians had made some last minute changes to the deal was supposedly what scuppered it. The Canadians say at the last minute, the Americans came in and said, we want a veto over your foreign trading relationships. And they say that's the non-starter. The Americans say that the Canadians had some last minute changes as well. But I don't think they've actually detailed what those were yet. And you'll have to forgive me if I don't entirely trust the Trump administration to be honest about it. So the only information I have right now is the Canadian and American sides of the story. And I'm kind of more inclined to trust the Canadians on that. So probably, I would guess, the US kind of came in at the last minute with a new demand that was beyond the pale for Ottawa. And that's why they canceled it. Anyway, the point is, there were a couple long-running trading issues that the Trump administration apparently saw fit to put a bunch of pressure on the Canadians to offer concessions on. Probably they were close to a deal, and then the Americans came in with some new demands. Probably on stuff related to China, since that's the only thing that I can think of that would make Washington make demands on as far as Canadian trade relations with other countries. And then that then triggered the tariffs that the Trump administration had been threatening. So the Canadian government, for its part, had said that they would think about retaliating, and then they said they were going to, and now they have. And so they've put tariffs on an equivalent value of American imports into Canada, presumably about $20 billion worth. What I have in my notes here is that the tariffs are going to be placed on American steel, dairy, appliances, and electronics. I wasn't able to find more detail than that. The Trump administration famously doesn't really tolerate retaliation to its trade nonsense very often, so it's possible we could see the Trump administration escalate this in response. So I'm kind of interested to see what the response will be. But it could also be that the Trump administration doesn't actually care about Canada that much. So it could be that they just kind of forget about this. They have famously short attention spans, and they prefer when the counterparty in a negotiation just caves. That's generally what they go for. That's part of the reason they go for maximum shock value in the initial negotiating process. At the start of negotiations, they go really hard. They see if you cave. If you cave in, they push for more and get as much as they can, and they move on to the next thing. If you don't cave, then they punish you for a while, and then they get bored and move on. It sounds stupid, but like that's the observed pattern with the Trump administration's trade negotiations, if not their foreign policy generally. Yeah, they would probably have given up on the Iran thing by now, if not for the fact that the Iranians refused to let them. The Iranian government seems pretty hell-bent on trying to punish the United States as much as possible. There's a hard limit to what they can realistically do, so dragging out the conflict is one way of punishing them. I think at the very least, at this point, if they're dragging it out this long, then I would guess they're almost certainly going to try to drag it out through the midterm elections. Because one of the points of leverage they have is to try to exact political consequences here. That's actually what they did to Jimmy Carter back in the day. They basically punished him by dragging out the Iran hostage crisis through the next election. And the fact that he had not been able to resolve that was a major point against him in the election. So in the midterm elections, they may be trying to do something similar. Drag out the conflict, try to embarrass the Trump administration, if not the Republican Party generally, and try to create some space for them to get punished at the polls, so to speak.
Well, that actually worked and stuck because I've heard family members talk about how Jimmy Carter is a very weak president because he couldn't get our hostages back, but Ronald Reagan did.
Kind of, yeah. There was some shenanigans there. There was definitely a desire by the Iranians to ensure Jimmy Carter did not get any credit for that.
Huh. Why did they not want him to get credit, but they're okay with someone else?
Deterrence. Like if you can show to the world and to U.S. politicians in particular that there are electoral consequences to fucking with Iran, then that has some deterrent value.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily a lot, but when you don't have much to work with, you try to get anything you can.
I see. It's one of those that if you mess with us, we'll embarrass you to your country and you'll regret it.
Yeah. So even if that comes at great cost to the Iranians, that's one of their few points of leverage, and so they have every reason to try to use it. So I don't know how much damage they can realistically do, because I don't know just how poorly the midterm elections will actually go for the Republicans. But nominally, the fact that the conflict will be ongoing, despite ostensibly being it was going to be like a 1 week conflict or whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly what they said at the start, but they were not planning for a multi-month conflict, certainly. So the fact that blew up in their faces is going to count against them. I'm going to laugh if the Iranians actually come to the table and agree to something like right after the midterm elections, because that'll be proof positive that they were definitely trying to use the elections as punishment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we did get a question. Was the Great Leap Forward necessary for modern China's success, or would immediate move toward Deng's reforms have made the same result with less suffering?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me think about that. Were they necessary? I mean, certainly Deng's reforms would have been delivering results much sooner if they'd gone in that direction, so that would have been good. But Deng's reforms partly succeeded because of their rapprochement with the United States and the broader West. And that was not going to happen like earlier than the 1970s. So if they'd done Deng's reforms sooner, yeah, it would have helped with economic growth, but you would not have seen the same dramatic results that we saw after they implemented them in the 70s. Like Deng's reforms in the 50s and 60s would have had like a limit to how much they could realistically deliver. And keep in mind that Deng's reforms also benefited from the previous 2 decades of industrialization. Like part of the reason China was able to take advantage of the opening period was because they had built so much industry that was ready to compete. A lot of that industry and the people who managed it were not really ready for free market competition, but they did kind of lay the groundwork for downstream producers to become competitive. Because if you want to manufacture stuff, you need raw materials, right? You need coal, you need steel, you need all that jazz. And China, immediately after World War II, or actually after the Civil War in 1949, in the roughly 10 to 20 year period after that, like they didn't even have that. Like they had a fair amount of industry built up over the course of the early 20th century, but they were not ready for like full on prime time yet by the time of like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So they really needed to invest in some of those industries to kind of lay the groundwork for more advanced industries, for light manufacturing, for heavy manufacturing, for stuff like military equipment and automobiles. Like all of that stuff requires some core supply chain stuff, some stuff up the supply chain that is readily available in order to make the downstream stuff viable. Hypothetically, they could have imported, but with the Cold War, there was a limit to how much they could do that. So it was useful. Like the industrialization of the 50s and 60s was useful in that sense. Was the Great Leap Forward itself necessary? Probably not. Because here's the thing about the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was not itself the industrialization plan for China in its early Cold War period. They'd actually already been implementing modernization programs, industrialization programs, etc. Like they had a whole litany of economic development stuff going on from 1949 to what the Great Leap Forward was, I want to say like 57 to 1960, whenever it was. So like before the Great Leap Forward and after the Civil War ended in 49, they actually made a lot of genuine progress. And they did it without like completely fucking it up like they did in the Great Leap Forward. So was the Great Leap Forward itself like representative of what the Chinese could do when they were trying to industrialize? No, because we have that example from before that where they were actually doing it and succeeding. So the Great Leap Forward was actually a departure from that. And it was pretty much a clear-cut example of Mao Zedong's political grasp exceeding his reach. Other way around. His political reach exceeding his grasp. There we go. Yeah, he was not known for being good at economic policy. He was well respected for being an excellent organizer, a good leader, a good tactician, a good strategist, but he was not known for being able to manage an economy. And in the 1950s, that's kind of what they needed. Like they were focusing on rebuilding the country and trying to catch up with the West. So they needed good managers. They needed good econ guys, and Mao was not that. And so his position in the party was kind of eroding. And so he made a Hail Mary play. For those of you non-Americans, that basically means he made a desperation play. He tried to delve into the economic sphere to restore his relevance and political capital within the Communist Party of China. And that became the Great Leap Forward. They had made so much progress so quickly over the previous 10 years. the peasantry of China to overthrow the government and become like the
Pause you
basis,
real
the
quick.
foundation.
Your audio cut out for about a minute, just like
Oh, shit.
8 seconds ago. Yeah.
Okay, let me think. What was the last thing I said? Some damn thing, right? I was talking about China, the Great Leap Forward, and the time between 1949 and the Great Leap Forward. Did I mention that?
You were saying he was trying to establish some kind of economic relevance.
Oh, okay, the Mao Zedong thing. Yeah, so he was losing relevance in the party because he was known as a great leader, a good organizer, good tactician, strategist, but he was not a good economic manager. That was not his thing. And that's what they needed in the 1950s, right? After the Civil War ended, they were focused on rebuilding the country. And so they needed good managers. Mao was not that. And so his relevance within the party was fading. And so he decided to make a big play to restore that relevance by delving into economic policy. And basically, his contribution was mass mobilization, because that was one of his original ideas from earlier periods of his career. Let's mobilize the peasants and overthrow the government. Let's make them the foundation of the Communist Party's power, etc. And so he figured, okay, we've made a lot of progress over the past 10 years economically. Let's try to accelerate that progress, and let's do it by mobilizing the peasants. And it was a really dumb idea. Like, peasants can't really do that. Like, you can mobilize the peasants, but what are you going to have them do? So what he had them do was make steel. The peasants don't know how to make steel. So what they ended up doing is taking a bunch of agricultural workers away from agriculture and get them to make a bunch of really shitty, low quality steel that nobody could use.
What the hell?
So the result then is that you lost agricultural production and you have nothing to show for it.
Yeah, bad steel.
Yeah. Now that's kind of a Cliff Notes version of it. Like, that's the short version. It's more complicated than that. And, it's actually even worse than that. It really the whole Great Leap Forward really exposed a lot of bureaucratic inefficiencies and inadequacies within the Communist Party. Like, they thought regression analysis and statistics was a bourgeois construct. And so they didn't want to use it. Like, they refused to use it to try to build a picture of what was happening in the economy. The counter argument was basically, we don't need that. We can just trust reports from officials, and that'll be enough. We don't need to use like sampling techniques. We don't need to grow out and try to get our own data at the national level. We'll just take information that's gathered at a local level by party apparatchiks, agglomerate that, and then that'll be our data. And that only works if your low-level officials, one, are gathering the data accurately, two, are not corrupt shitheads, and three, do not have political incentive to misreport. And guess what? All of those things were true. Like, it was a perfect recipe for bad data. And so because the government at the national level was not collecting any data of its own, it had to rely on like what became exceedingly inaccurate data. And that's actually kind of an untold aspect of the Great Leap Forward and why it resulted in a mass famine. It could be that if the government at the national level actually had good data, that they would have recognized the famine conditions manifesting earlier on, and they would have canceled the industrialization drive. But that didn't happen. So the result is a failed industrialization drive and a mass fucking famine. Total disaster. The whole episode did not contribute to China's modernization. So was the Great Leap Forward necessary for China's modernization? No, absolutely not. So certainly if Dong's reforms had been implemented sooner, they would have done much better, especially if they'd done that instead of the Great Leap Forward. But I would reiterate the earlier point. The Dong's opening would not have been as impactful in the 50s and 60s as it was in the 70s and 80s, just because conditions internationally were much different in those eras. And also because China's economy and industry had not been as built up by that point. Like, they were not quite starting from scratch, but they were starting from near scratch at that point after the Civil War had ended. So the reforms would not have had as much of an impact. When you want to build heavy industry, you kind of do need like big state interference. The Japanese and South Koreans kind of showed that state capitalism can do a pretty good job of building a lot of big, heavy industries like mining industries, steel, etc. And a lot of that is a prerequisite to building more modern goods of one kind or another. So the experience of modernization is very frequently the experience of states intervening in the economy to create sort of that bottom rung of the supply chain. Again, minerals, refining, steel, etc., and then opening up the economy later on so that producers of more modern goods can take advantage of that lower rung of the supply chain and build stuff that doesn't have to be imported. It's a very common pattern. So China was kind of at that first stage of that pattern in the 1950s. And so while Deng's reforms would have been good, again, they would not have been like great. And probably the government would have taken on as statist a role, even with Deng's reforms in that period in the 1950s, as they had without Deng's reforms in the 1950s, just because that would have been prerequisite to developing a lot of those big heavy industry type firms. Yeah, one of the interesting things I've read about the reform period is that the Chinese government did not intend for it to be like a full embrace of the free market. So I'm talking like late 70s and then through the 1980s. The Communist Party of China was just opening up a little bit, and the main impetus was not so much stabilizing the economy as it was trying to basically, what's the word I want? Help out state industries. Because there were a number of major industries, basically all of the biggest employers in China were state-run companies of one kind or another. And so the hope is that they could make them more efficient by subjecting them to some competition. And the hope was also that the free market side of the economy would generate tax revenue that could pay for the subsidies that the state-owned industries needed. So the state-owned sector in China was actually a major impetus for the reform and opening period of China's history. It wasn't just them shifting away from state control of the economy and state industries. Supporting the state-controlled side of the economy, rather, was actually a major driver. It's a pretty interesting point that I read, I think, a year or two ago about the reform period. Later on, it was actually more in the 1990s that they really leaned in to free market reform. Like by the 90s, it was no longer about trying to prop up an uncompetitive part of the economy with a healthy part of the economy. In the 90s, they actually started purging state companies. Like that whole state-controlled part of the economy, they started shifting away from that entirely. There are still big parts of the economy that the state controls. There are like some heavily state-influenced banks and whatnot. But you don't see like the huge state-owned companies like you used to back in the day. And it was largely in the 90s that they were dismantled. So that was the real free market change. The real shift in policy was more in the 90s. And that was spearheaded not by Deng Xiaoping, who was quasi-retired at that point. You never really retire from the party. If you're powerful and influential, you kind of still manipulate things from outside, even after you're out of power. But in the 90s, the effort to modernize and liberalize the economy was led more by, what was his name? Frogman. Jiang Zemin. And his hatchet man, the guy that he actually had do a lot of the bureaucratic fighting to get reforms passed and get shit done, was a guy named Zheng Ruji. I'm butchering these guys' names, I know it. I'm gonna try to look them up so I can do them justice here. Zhu Rongji, there we go. And then the other guy was, let's see, Jiang Zemin. Oh, I actually got it right. Yeah, that's the guy, Jiang Zemin. Okay. So Jiang Zemin was the paramount leader in the 1990s. He was a part of the Shanghai clique within the Communist Party. And he very heavily favored reform, leaned into it, and made that the centerpiece of Chinese Communist Party policy, rather than having it be like an enabler for another objective, as it kind of had been in the 80s. And again, the bureaucrat who did the most legwork as far as making that happen was Zhu Rongji. Actually, Zhu Rongji, it's interesting we're talking about this guy because he actually just died like a week or two ago.
Yeah, chat just mentioned that.
Yeah, he was in the news recently. And the party was actually going out of its way to try to suppress memorials in the public. Yeah, the government doesn't really like it when people when people in China pay too much attention to former leaders. They're a little wary about that.
Do they also act wary about like honoring the ancient Chinese leaders?
No, nobody gives a shit.
Okay.
They don't have to worry about it one way or the other. There's very few there are very few historical leaders in China's history that modern Chinese would venerate. Because keep in mind, the modern Chinese identity was largely born in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in that period, modernizers in China faced an immense amount of resistance from the established conservative elite. And that conservative elite was conflated heavily with previous dynasties. Because they themselves, like conservatives themselves in that time period, very much legitimized and justified their power in terms of Chinese history, historical norms, traditional power structures, etc. And so as a result, China's generally the youth, but also older folks who were modernizers and wanted to change things in China really came to hate them like a lot. That was one of the defining traits of pretty much all sides of China's political spectrum, other than the conservatives. So, like right-wing nationalists that wanted to modernize, left-wing nationalists that wanted to modernize, the communists, the fascists, anybody and everybody who wanted to modernize hated the conservative traditionalists. And a lot of what constituted historical China in a material sense and a more abstract political sense came to be hated in turn as well.
Oh. Like
So
you are the
Communist
people
Party,
who are holding us back.
yeah, exactly. So, of course, people in China love their culture, love the history, et cetera, but politically speaking, it's not an issue. Like, people are very glad politically to have moved beyond that. So you generally don't see veneration of past leaders that much, at least leaders that ruled dynastic China. At least not in any kind of modern sense. You know, you may appreciate a good leader in the context of his time, but nobody now is going to look back and say, well, I wish we had a leader like that now. Because leaders like that were a big reason for the century of humiliation and a whole bunch of other issues in Chinese politics and culture.
That makes sense. But yeah, with this particular person who recently just passed away, if someone was a recent leader, then their, I guess, family and potential supporters could gain momentum if there's too much support for somebody, even for a memorial.
That's what the party is kind of afraid of. There's not very much risk of that actually happening because, you know, he's just a bureaucrat, and I don't think Zemin's regime is remembered especially fondly. I think people are nostalgic for the 90s, and people did and do appreciate that, you know, his government was much more open than the current government, like easily. So a lot of people do miss that. But he didn't have the same following that some of the leaders in the 80s had. Actually, the big reformers in the 80s had much more of a following amongst the public. Like, have you ever heard of Hu Yaobang?
No.
So let me see. So during Deng Xiaoping's government in the 80s, and then actually after in the late 80s when Zhao Ziyang was technically paramount leader, the lead reformer, like within the party, was Hu Yaobang, and he basically constituted the right wing of the Communist Party at that time, which is always a risky wing of the party to be in, in China. But in the 80s, the right kind of had a resurgence. They had the whole reform period. They were given a lot of leeway to kind of change how things had been done for the past few decades. And Hu Yaobang kind of became the face of that. And he actually died in the 1980s. And there was a big, I don't want, public outcry is not the right word. A lot of people tried to memorialize him in a very public way. Like they really wanted to celebrate him because they liked him as a reformer. And the party really did not like that. And the party had much more reason to be concerned about that, given all of the political tension in China in the 80s over corruption, controversies around reform. The recent past, keep in mind the Cultural Revolution had really only just ended like 10 years before. So memories were still really raw of that. So there were certain factions and people in the party that were kind of venerated to a degree at that point. And they did kind of pose a threat to the more established, risk-averse parts of the party. That's less of a problem now because there's much more. The party has opened up pretty considerably. There's been a lot of prosperity. So the party's legitimacy is kind of more intact now than it was in the 80s. And even if people do appreciate, Zemin's period in the 90s, I don't think anybody really thinks that he would be that different now. Because there had already kind of been a turn towards the left and towards authoritarianism, starting with the end of, what's his name, Hu Jintao's rule. And that was kind of done with the approval of Jiang Zemin. Because again, you never really retire from the party, even after you're no longer in an official position to govern China. Like, you're still going to be influential. And there was kind of a consensus in the party that they needed to crack down a little bit, starting in the, roughly early 2010s. So probably things would not be all that different in the grand scheme of things. So for that reason and the others I mentioned, yeah, the party doesn't have as much reason to worry about, say, the public venerating, what's his name? I keep getting his first and last name mixed up. That guy's death is not as much of a problem as previous deaths have been. Mm-hmm. But the party, of course, is very, very risk averse, so they still take steps.
Kind of makes me wonder, you mentioned Japan, they don't really have democracy in the sense that it waffles between multiple parties. It's just one party. Are there other countries like that you know
of? This is fraught territory, Neuro.
Oh. Some people get mad.
Well, we're getting into a discussion about illiberal democracy. Mm-hmm. And populists don't really like that term. They tend to kind of tense up at that. But yeah, there is definitely such a thing as illiberal democracy, a country with a political system that is nominally democratic, but with institutions that have been kind of corrupted and perverted to produce pre-engineered outcomes. Mm-hmm. Not to the point where they're full-on authoritarian. They do still have elections. They are still nominally competitive. But a lot of the rules have been changed to benefit certain groups and parties. So a lot of countries and their leaders and certain voters would bristle at being classified as an illiberal democracy. Hungary under Orban was unquestionably an illiberal democracy. But I noticed over the years that whenever I referred to it as such on here, there was almost always one or two people that complained.
Mm.
So the interesting question here is not so much are there other illiberal democracies? There definitely are. Hungary had been one. Um, Places like Slovakia, Croatia, to a lesser degree Czechia, those are all kind of borderline cases. Possibly Romania. Maybe Germany and France soon.
And what do
They're
you mean?
trending in that direction. Sorry, what?
What do you mean by that? They're just
Oh, the populist right wing parties in France and Germany have been doing very well in polling
oh,
over the
that's like
past
Marie Le Pen's
year.
party, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, in France, and then Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. So I think Alternative for Deutschland is actually polling the best now among any party in Germany.
Well,
Yeah, so that bodes ill well for the establishment parties. Let's see. I think a more interesting question, though, at least for me, is whether or not Japan is an illiberal democracy. Because even though they have some of the trappings of a liberal democracy, I've never seen them classified as such. It is still competitive, it's still open, and more so than a place like Orban's Hungary. And again, a big part of the LDP's dominance is not just the fact that they kind of game the electoral system. Um, it's also the fact that the opposition is just kind of a mess and always has been, pretty much. And that's not something you can legislate. I'm reminded here of a joke from Mystery Science Theater 3000. They were making fun of a movie called Prince of Space. And at one point, they joked, his superpower is having really incompetent enemies.
that's funny.
Yeah. So the LDP, to a degree, can be said to have the advantage in Japanese politics of perpetually having incompetent opponents. The opposition parties are very rarely a threat to them. And again, that's not something that they impose on them for the most part. You know, probably there was some suppression of some kind during the Cold War, but Cold War's been over for a while. And like I mentioned, the opposition has actually been in power a couple of times. They just very rarely make a good accounting of themselves to the point where the LDP invariably wins back power later. So that line between liberal democracy and illiberal democracy is kind of a fine one. It's ambiguous and undefined.
Let's see.
Japan is kind of close to the border, but in general, from what I've read about the institutions and the LDP, it does still qualify as a liberal democrat. Sorry, as a liberal democracy. But of the liberal democracies, it's probably the closest of them to being in a liberal democracy. The LDP would probably not have to make too many changes to make the jump.
The chat's asking, isn't Germany mixed member proportional?
Yes. They have both proportional representation and first past the post. Sorry, first past the post voting districts. So yes, it is a mixed system.
I see.
I don't think Japan does that. I think they're all first past the post.
This is a bit off topic, but chat mentioned there's some buzz in the US about some flock video surveillance thing.
I really need to read more about that. That story has kind of flown under my radar. Yeah, there's kind of a growing trend of vandalism, I guess technically, where people actually go out of their way to damage and or destroy flock cameras. Are you familiar with flock cameras?
No.
Okay, so here's the gist of it. There's a company that sets up cameras and it integrates them all into one network. So all of the images that are recorded on the camera all go basically into one big computer, and then Flock uses AI to track people or other kinds of information, whatever.
Mm.
And the concern basically is that it's a panopticon, that it is going to be the cornerstone of a vast surveillance state that is just going to watch everybody everywhere all at once, track everybody's movement, record it, sell the information, give the information to the government, and basically destroy public privacy such as we know it.
Mm.
And there have been a couple examples where the powers were abused. Police departments basically subscribe to Flock and try to use their network to find people, who they have warrants out for, or if they're trying to chase somebody down, stuff like that. But there are a couple examples of them abusing their access to that network. I think the last one I read about was a cop looking up information about a girlfriend or an ex, something like that.
Oh no.
Yeah, so not really knocking the allegations about abuse of power there. And there's also the fact that cities and municipalities and whatnot that cut deals with Flock sometimes give them privileges, whatnot. They themselves kind of pay them. And people don't really like that. They don't like the idea of being forced to be a part of a vast surveillance network that is going to invariably be abused to some degree. So people have been lobbying their governments to not participate in the Flock network, to not set up Flock cameras, and to block anybody else in city limits from allowing them to be set up. There's a whole movement there on that. And correspondent with that is a sort of subterranean, basically illegal movement that is teaching people outright how to disable these cameras. So you can find a whole bunch of YouTube videos and stuff about how to properly damage or destroy a Flock camera without getting caught. Like, they're very brazen about it, and they're also very popular. So clearly, there's demand.
Yeah. No, the reason I ask is there was a couple chatters who mentioned it, but also a video just came up in a social media feed that was instructional on how to disable one of the cameras. I was like, wow, that's very. It's kind of like revolutionary energy in the sense that you are directly breaking a law because you believe there's government overreach. But this isn't the government directly. This is a company, a private company, that is doing stuff that the government could then use on a systematic scale. So it still effectively ends up being an invasion of privacy and an overreach of control. Yeah. So I can see why people dislike it.
Yeah, I forget the name of the company. Maybe it is just Flock. I'll defer to Chad on that. But the tech company that controls the network insists that they run it in an ethical way and that there are limits to what anybody who subscribes can do with the network. But of course, it's the 2020s, so there's basically no trust. Like, big tech companies have long since lost the trust of the general public. The government, damn sure, has long since lost the general trust of the public. So, between them, between the government and big tech, there's no trust to work with. So when they come out and say stuff like that, please trust us, we run it ethically, blah, 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 everybody just assumes they're lying.
Yeah.
Hence the movement.
Yeah, makes sense.
So this is kind of paralleling the rise of the anti-data center movement, which is gaining a lot of traction now. And it would not surprise me if the Flock thing dovetails on that, and we end up with a lot of laws restricting the ability to set up Flock cameras or to integrate or network cameras in the way that they do, and maybe even just blocking the company entirely from doing commerce in given states. We're still a ways off from that, but that's the direction of travel right now.
If I could make a vague prediction, I feel like we're moving toward some conflict moment between the massive power creep of tech and the rights of humans, and
Mhm.
how it's been sliding. Like, we've been gradually getting more and more types of tech that invade our lives in more and more ways. So more of our lives are being kind of quantified and monetized to, like, gain a resource for them to make more money. And the average consumer is aware of almost none of these things and doesn't really have much power when it comes to opting out of stuff. If a company is just setting up and doing things, the actual individual citizen has very little control over fighting against that. But if enough people agree that it's an overreach, then they won't be able to get away with it. The question is, what will the overreach be that brings us to a breaking point? Because if you're mentioning the flock camera people and the data center people can agree on stuff, how long until they have like an Occupy Wall Street moment where it's not necessarily going to be a revolution for the whole country, but it can be a pain point that causes people to be vocal and start to organize in some way?
Mhm.
Because the data center stuff is definitely, I think, a bipartisan issue. It's a local person issue. It doesn't matter what stripe, if you're a Republican or Democrat, whatever, it doesn't matter. The success and just the kind of cultural integrity of your town matters to you because you live there. So any big corporate overreach that's foreign and hurts everybody, it causes a natural rally point for everybody.
Mhm.
But we'll see. I know there's like a lot of potential things ahead as robots occupy more and more of our day-to-day life. If we think about it, we already have a lot of robots in our home. Like your phone, you could think of as a robot that has certain jobs. Your Roomba, if you have like a vacuum robot, different automated lighting systems. We have a lot of robots that we're comfortable with now. But what is the point that we don't want to be monitored past a certain point? And how do we even track that we're being monitored? Things like this are pretty difficult to do, but the technology advances faster than our rights regarding it because it's hard to anticipate the future technologies that we don't have yet. So we can't really begin the legal work for how do we protect ourselves and give citizens rights on these new frontiers. We don't even know what the new frontiers are going to be. So the tech companies basically need to innovate stuff and abuse people to the point that they realize they don't like it and then fight back and then get politicians to agree to make a law so it doesn't happen again. But
Mhm.
we're about to round that corner of tech where people's day-to-day life becomes more and more integrated with technology and their rights related to their technology become more fundamental to their identity. As our generation, the millennials, become the olds and we have the keys to power, there will probably be some young whippersnapper stuff that we don't quite understand or we're not on board with, but fits with whatever the new era is going to be. It's pretty interesting. I think throughout human history, there's been technology increasing, but technology improving is in fits and starts. It's not consistent throughout time. And there are periods that are very anti technology where they're scared of it, they try to shun it, they try to like kill scientists and inventors and call them witches. So right now, technology is booming in all directions. The question is, where will we need to reel it back to make sure we get the best outcome for ourselves? And there is a point
Well,
too that's like, I guess, a philosophical or existential question for humanity, which is how much do we need to expand and to grow to thrive? Do we need to keep
mhm.
growing our population, or is our population fine? Do we need to keep advancing the amount of energy that we're generating, or do we need to think about how to use our energy more efficiently as it is? These are like big questions that we don't really have consensus on, but there's going to be a sort of best fit line for what track we end up going down.
And I think there's also an overarching question about administrative capacity, because with tech expanding as much as it has and becoming as powerful as it has, to what degree can states realistically constrain it?
Mm-hmm.
If you want your government to really deal with tech, for one, you need your government to be able to regulate it without interference. But obviously, tech is wealthy enough to be a major lobbyist.
Mm-hmm.
And two, you kind of need your government to be trustworthy and to actually represent you and not to be chock full of corrupt shitheads. That's a major barrier for many, many countries, especially in the developing world, increasingly in a few developed world countries. And without that, you can't really realistically constrain them. Like, that's not on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do then? That's another open question.
Embrace corporate rule. Forgo government. Full companies. Are you hashtag Team Tesla or hashtag Team Google?
I'm team pitchforks.
Yeah. It's interesting that I'm having this discussion with you from the middle of nowhere, South Dakota, because a lot of these issues are very far from me at this point, which I can kind of get the allure for people wanting to move out to the country. There are definitely downsides to it, absolutely, but the ever increasing power creep of computers and society and government and stuff, yeah, it's a big thing, and I can see how people would want to distance themselves from that and keep some traditions and privacies and so on. It makes sense. It's nice not having cameras around. It feels a little bit invasive, and some of this is just what people tolerate. But being monitored all the time, it can be annoying even if you're not doing anything wrong, just because it feels like, I don't know, maybe unnecessary. But it can improve safety in some ways, so I can understand as well why you want to have some level of surveillance. Did you see Batman The Dark Knight? Sounds random, but this is related.
I have, in fact, seen it.
Right. So you know that, like, thing he uses where it's sending signals between everyone's cell phone so he can triangulate everybody's position. And
Yeah, I do remember that. It's
yeah,
been a while, but yeah.
Lucius Fox is letting him use it on the condition that he destroys it when he's done finding the Joker.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty nice commentary on this situation. It doesn't exactly answer what the best fit is, because Batman does use the technology to try to solve the problem, but then he does destroy it after. But our government certainly doesn't destroy surveillance technology after they're done using it. They would just go to use it again.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the public really needs to just reckon with it. Maybe we're kind of starting to, but oh man, they're really late to the party. Because I remember when you, me, and Kukio back in the day would argue about that.
Yeah, he was harping on receding privacy as long as I knew him.
Yeah.
And that was a relatively more primitive format of them harvesting our data. They still were, but now they harvest our data in even newer and more exciting ways than before.
Yeah.
Well,
we'll see what happens.
yeah, good luck to everyone in their communities. Try to fight for what you believe in, figure out what's impacting your community, and make your own good decisions. There are lots of different propaganda pieces out there that are trying to get you to believe this or that. So bear in mind, if anyone's trying to get you to vote for something, they have an agenda. You just want to know what that agenda is so you can inform yourself. Be smart. Well, very good. Sometimes we hit our stride later into Agent Smith rather than earlier. I can kind of tell, like, sometimes I didn't show up with the whole bunch. It's been a slow week. We're kind of like, where did we go? And then 2 hours and 45 minutes in, we get a great topic. We're learning about the Great Leap Forward in China. It's fresh. It's exciting. I'm learning. And then we go overtime, and it's like, yeah.
Oh, my apologies.
No. You're volunteering your time, so I'm chilling.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
If I wanted to shoo you away, I could have done so an hour ago.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, cool. I'll let you know if there are any interesting developments. It's always fun hearing local townspeople's takes on stuff. Small town life is very different from being in the suburbs or the big city. I actually got a job offer just today to work at a restaurant, just because someone they like my candor and my bearing and the way that I talk, and thought that I would be good to serve at their restaurant. So,
Oh,
yeah, you get all these kind of random things just because people know you. It's a small community. They need some help. They'll ask. I'm still going to be a streamer and everything. I'm not going to take this job, but it's funny to get that because that doesn't really happen when you're in the big city in the same way.
no. Yeah, you're definitely in one of those parts of the country where there's a shortage of labor.
Yeah. Yeah, we get migrant labor here during the tourist season just to be able to serve all the tables of all the crazy motorcyclists. And just summer tourism as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my hamstring is mostly healed. I'm able to jog around a little bit. Have you been able to walk this past week?
Yep, I walked today. Walked in 100-degree heat.
Oh my gosh. You can always take a pass if it's too hellish. I respect the Texas heat.
Well, if you're going to walk in the day in Texas in August, you can expect some extreme heat. If I were smarter, I would walk in either the morning or the evening when it's much cooler.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really feel comfortable doing that out in a suburb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be kind of creepy. If you're just a person walking around in the middle of the night, you're like, sir, what are you doing here? Oh, I was getting exercise. Sure you were.
Yeah, there actually are parks in South Dallas. So if I were more entrepreneuring, I could drive out to one and just walk out there, and that would be fine. But I don't really want to go all that way just to walk for like 15 minutes or whatever.
Yeah. But you could, and that's your freedom as an American.
Yep.
Sure. Well, cool. I will issue you your same challenge. Please stay safe and don't brave too much of the heat, okay?
Understood. I'll try not to die.
Survive.
There you go.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, Agent Smith, for your time. Thank you, chat, for your participation. We see you in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.